My name is Daoud Kutab. I'm a journalist and I run a media organization in Amman, Jordan. I also write for Al Monitor and Arab News. And in 1996, I noticed something very strange in the Arab world. If I ever wanted to know anything about Syria, all I had to do was open the Egyptian newspapers. And if I wanted to know about Algeria, all I had to do was go to the Tunisian papers. And if I wanted to know about Morocco, all I had to do was... And so I basically discovered early on that Arab countries' media are really, really free about everything in the Arab world except their own country. So I created something called Amin, the Arab Media Internet Network. Amin, basically we brought all the Arab newspapers into one site, and so you can really find out about your country just by reading other papers. Later on in 2000, I created the Arab world's first internet radio, Amman Net Radio, which was an interesting invention because most people start with FM and then they go to the internet, but in Jordan they didn't have internet, they didn't have FM licenses, so we began with the internet, and then with the help of a Palestinian radio station, we basically bypassed the government monopoly. So we were broadcasting out of Amman, downloaded in Bethlehem, played back into Amman, and so basically we did something totally illegal, but in a legal way. And that began a process of training people into how to use local media, and the internet really was helpful. But at that time, quickly I realized I did a course at Princeton University that governments were really quickly catching up on the problems of the internet, and they were creating their own, the government and the intelligence, their own internet websites. Some of the famous internet sites created early on were done with the government's help because they really wanted to, A, be part of the system, and also they wanted to use that to kind of catch some of the biggest opponents. So this session today is going to be very open. We'll try to address both the problem, the dissent, and trying to find a way to find other narratives. I am very proud and happy to have with us Sara Lee Wilson from the Human Rights Watch and Courtney Retsch from Committee to Protect Journalists. Thanks for the prize you gave me a while back. Hala Al-Dosari from the MIT Center for International Studies, and Such Jahali from the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. So we'll begin with dealing with the problem. I would like to talk about how governments engage their own citizens in the Arab world. We'll begin with Human Rights Watch Middle East Director Sara Lee Wilson. Can you please tell us about the basic issues of government's efforts to silence attempts by citizens to express themselves? And let's zoom in on what is happening not only in the public at large, but also to the profession of journalists. Sara.
So basically, I think in a very broad brushstroke, we can say that the governments of the Arab world see their own citizens, their own populations as a threat. They are a threat to their legitimacy. They are a threat to their privilege. They are a threat to their corruption. And in many ways, they are enemies or potential enemies. And that was very clearly on display in the 2011 uprisings, where the citizens of much of the Arab world made it clear that they were going to vote with their feet and emerged to protest. And since then, and on the heels, of course, of the expansion of Arab journalism through previously uncontrollable means, such as the satellite, Al Jazeera, Al Arabiya, other satellite stations broadcasting from outside the region, whether it's London or Istanbul or other places, as well as the free social media, the Facebook and the Twitter, that suddenly empowered their citizenry with both knowledge, information, and the ability to voice their opinions. Big threats to Arab governments that don't want their publics to be knowledgeable, informed, and able to express their opinions. We basically saw and continue to see a very massive broadening legal and forceful crackdown and control on these means of information and expression. One basic way that governments have now sought to curtail the ability of their citizens to obtain knowledge and information is by blocking internet stations, satellite stations, websites, including Human Rights Watch's in many, many countries, because they don't want their citizens to have this information and knowledge. The other is by a vastly expanded body of laws that at one point were more traditionally defined to curtail speech that disrupted order or threatened values or actually incited violence. And in fact, in Kuwait's law, you will still see that speech that's defined as criminal actually has to be tied to some kind of act of violence. Instead, in many other states, now you have cybercrime laws and other bolstered limits on speech that don't have any criteria for, or let me say, the only criteria for determining what is unlawful speech that can end you up in jail is if it is critical of the government. I mean, you have laws in the region that specifically say if you criticize the state or you criticize the government by insulting them, you will go to jail. And the governments have not been shy about using these laws to jail people. And so now it is actually a crime to criticize governments. They've also, in some countries that may not have these expansive cybercrime laws or as expensive, extensively use criminal defamation laws. So Lebanon, for example, which might otherwise stand out as a place where the press is freer and citizens are freer, in fact has dozens and dozens of people who have been criminally prosecuted for defamation. Basically, if you criticize a government official or a government minister by saying his policies are bad, you have defamed him and he's going to sue you, or some public citizen is going to sue you, and you're going to go to jail. So that's another common tool. It's also used quite a bit in Morocco. Finally, the new expanded tools of repression are surveillance, massive and wide-scale surveillance of citizenry. Obviously, this is not a phenomenon that's limited to the Middle East and North Africa. Indeed, the technologies that the governments are using for this come from Western states, and Israel, in particular, is a big producer of surveillance technology, which of course it uses against its own population and the Palestinian territories. But this is a pretty new phenomenon of limiting, controlling, policing, monitoring the expression of citizens. And then, there's always the old style brute thuggery, where governments use physical violence to beat, arrest, detain, and torture journalists, citizens, writers, without any legal pretext at all. So
thanks, Sarah. Thank you. I remember you talked about the insult law. Our radio station once had a person read from the internet comments to people about the parliament. And somebody wrote the parliament in Jordan is Majlis Dawab, مش Majlis Nawab. Dawab means donkeys. And the parliament was really upset, and they went to court and they fined this 10,000 JDs and so on, because somebody on radio said that they are not parliamentarians. So it's a very well used law. But most constitutions, and I'm directing my question now to Courtney, most constitutions in the Arab world clearly say that freedom of expression is guaranteed. Now, usually it follows one line, in accordance to the law. And that in accordance to the law usually is where they really restrict you. So can you tell us more about how governments in the Arab region achieve this repressive outcome that we're seeing, despite the fact that expression is guaranteed, and freedom of expression and speech is guaranteed, so-called, in the Constitution?
Sure. So I think it's pretty clear that none of the countries in the Middle East are governed by their constitutions. The idea that you would have a constitution and then have a loophole except as defined by law, and then have criminal defamation, as Sarah said, criminal false news laws, cybercrime laws that criminalize journalism, clearly provide some major loopholes. So what we've seen is a real trend in the criminalization of journalism and the criminalization of speech online. So prior to the uprisings, there was a lot more space for free expression, for creativity online, and a lot of the governments didn't quite figure out what was happening online, and they thought, okay, well, that's kind of out there, this virtual world. But they quickly, obviously, learned the lesson during the uprisings, and they learned very quickly and started cooperating and coordinating. And I don't think any of them have given one thought to their constitution. There have been a proliferation of cybercrime laws, of counterterrorism laws, of countering violent extremism laws, and of false news laws. And so Egypt, where I worked and did my doctoral studies, used to be the only country on Freedom House's Freedom of the Press Index that ranked as partly free on that index and not free on the Political and Civil Liberties Index, which was kind of interesting. And, you know, there was a bit of space for critical media. Certainly it was state-dominated media. But what we have seen now is that across the region, the regimes in power are combining traditional censorial tactics, such as imprisoning and harassing journalists, with sophisticated surveillance, computational propaganda, state-sponsored trolling, and other efforts to silence the independent press. So last year, we saw that of the 250 journalists who were imprisoned around the world during our annual census, 61 journalists were imprisoned in the Middle East, with Egypt topping the list every year for the past 3 years running as one of the top 3 jailers of journalists. And we've seen record numbers of journalists jailed around the world. So that's really saying something about the crackdown there. We've also got, you know, severe censorship. So whereas there used to be a bit of more space online or on social media platforms, now we have targeted, systematic censorship online, both with respect to specific websites as well as to entire internet shutdowns during times of protest. I think a lot of people thought that the lesson learned during the shutdown of the Egyptian internet in 2011, which was really the first big news event of that type, was that it would send a signal that that you can't do that or you're going to suffer economically. And instead, we've seen the exact opposite signal sent, and that's now a standard tactic used throughout the region, from Iraq to Lebanon to Egypt and elsewhere. And then you couple this with sophisticated PR, public relations, and strategy consulting from both domestic and Western firms to help these countries control their image, to help them adopt, as Sarah mentioned, very sophisticated surveillance technologies. And whereas the most recent, I'm sure many of you saw the most recent revelations about the NSO group hacking WhatsApp, that technology, Pegasus, has been linked to the murder of Jamal Khashoggi in terms of being found on his colleague's phone. It has been linked to the murder of it has been linked to journalists who were murdered in Mexico and elsewhere. And of course, the revelations by Facebook, which owns WhatsApp, shows that more than 1,000 people were targeted, including hundreds of journalists. But this is also not new, right? We remember that after the Egyptian uprising, they found Nilefish, very sophisticated surveillance software, which also not only has the ability to hack and target these journalists, but also creates a chilling effect as people assume that they are being watched and are under surveillance. So basically, we see, I think, that a lot of these governments have essentially ignored their constitutional provision. They've adopted laws and practices that completely undermine rhetorical guarantees for press freedom.
Thanks, Courtney. Mentioning cybercrime law, we fought very hard in Jordan to stop detention of journalists. And so we finally changed the law, and now journalists cannot be detained. And then they passed the cybercrime law, in which a journalist can be detained for what they write online. So you can write an article in a print newspaper, nothing happens. You don't go to jail, nothing, you're not even detained. The moment somebody pushes publish online the same article that you were exempt from being detained, you can be detained based on the cybercrime law. So the governments are like always trying to find new ways to restrict. We're going to move now to the Gulf region, and we're very fortunate to have Hala Tosari from MIT Center with us. Now, we all heard, amazing and scary, detailed story about what happened to Jamal Khashoggi, but I really am interested in the situation of female journalists, especially in Saudi Arabia. I've known a few of them, and I found them to be the most courageous women of all. The journalists really fight very hard. So, Hala, can you tell us more about writers, researchers who are around, especially those who were rounded up in September 2017, specifically the way the charge sheets against these women activists were used?
Yeah, sure. So we've seen patterns of, unprecedented attack on not only on women activists, but also on thought leaders, on religious reformers, on influential influencers online, on influential business leaders. So it all started soon after the ascent of Mohammed bin Salman, the Prince Mohammed bin Salman, to become a crown prince. Those types of the pattern of arrests were very much unprecedented, as I said, in scope, because it really affected everyone under the pretext of protecting national security. Also fall under the pretense of, violating the cybercrimes law or violating the anti-terror law. Also, we've seen the nature, the escalating, basically, coercion and brutal treatment of those detained to the extent that we've heard of people being disabled, being killed under torture or under interrogations. Unfortunately, because of the media blocking in Saudi Arabia, we couldn't really verify much of those arrests. But with the advent of the leak on the Khashoggi's murder, what happened is many of the families of those detained had to pressure their imprisoned relatives to ask about the remarks. The first time I've heard about those signs, I was very much like, suspicious. They did not really, they're naturally not a result of a confinement, even if it's a solitary confinement, uncontrollable shaking of hands, bruises in certain areas like on the neck. So the families and myself and other activists were very much like worried that they might really assign to similar pattern of torture to those that has been leaked through those who were detained and the families of those detained at the Reds, or similar to what happened to Jamal. So then the families were able to obtain more information, and some of those families were placed under travel bans for leaking those information, and some of them were arrested, the son of one of the prominent women activists. The charges were very much like ambiguous and catch-all charges, and very much like related to their line of work, contacting media journalists, the official foreign media journalists, getting in touch with NGOs, sharing research through WhatsApp, research relevant to their own area of expertise, whether it's like Hassan Farhan al-Maliki, one of the religious reformers, having books that talks about how to reform the Islamic jurisprudence, or the women activists having shared, having evidence that on their phones that they have shared research on reforms of women's rights with other citizens in the Arab Gulf states. So we've learned from those kinds of charges that it is a charge, based on curtailing their transnational networking and association, very much like in line with what my co-panelists have described. It's not directly towards a certain expression, but to having more influence on that.
Thank you so much. Obviously, all these problems we've been hearing about, human rights violations of things like the First Amendment, I'm sure are covered very well in the American press, right? We have a situation where, unfortunately, the American media has not been covering such a violation, and I would like Sat to give us a bit more details, especially about the general coverage of these issues, but and specifically about Palestine, and how the main themes of Israel's narratives since 67 or 682 has been evolving.
Yeah, one, I put Palestine to the side for a second because it's a separate case. But in terms of looking at this question and how American media tell these stories, I think there's two levels at which we have to think about. One is the kind of broad cultural level in terms of how the Arab world is understood. And this frame has been around for a long time. Edward Said talked about it in the 1980s. Jack Shaheen talked about it through his book, Real Bad Arabs. And this is, the Arab world is essentially one different globe. And there's very little differentiation within it. And it's really seen through this notion of the clash of civilizations, that this is a very, very different world, that they're not like us at all. That they're alien, that they're given to violence, that's where terrorism flows from. So that's the frame, that's the context within which within which we then talk about specific things. In terms of how these events are covered, again, we can go back, there's an institutional structure then on top of the cultural one. And the institutional structure is the structure of American corporate media, and the relationship between American corporate media and the American political elites. And again, Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman gave the best kind of framework for this, which is, if you want to understand how American media are treating events around the world, the most important thing to look at is whether the countries that are being looked at are enemies or whether they're allies. If they're allies, there will be a very different frame given to whatever problem we look at. If they are enemies, there'll be something else. And this is a very, very, Chomsky and Herman did this very scientifically, but you can just think about it. Look at the case of Saddam Hussein. Before he invaded Kuwait, he was a friend of American elites and was covered very well. The moment he invaded Kuwait, he became an enemy and went from being not really talked about to being Hitler. Same person doing the same thing, and the only thing that changed was the relationship to the American government. And I think that when you look at someone like the murder of Khashoggi as well, Khashoggi became, in one sense, he wasn't a Saudi. He became an American because of his work with Washington Post, and was seen in a very different way, with almost no mention of what else has gone on in Saudi Arabia and of course many of the other the repressive Arab states. We do know a lot about the enemies. We know a lot about Assad and about his brutality. And so I think those are the two things. If you have the cultural thing, then on top of that, this institutional frame that can be made sense of in looking at the relationship between corporate media and American elites.
Thank you. Sarah, and let's go into the silencing of the dissent, and what does it mean? With Human Rights Watch, this jailing of journalists, silencing of them, how does it affect the kind of ecosystem of human rights? How does it affect the future? What does it do to human rights activists? Does it do to journalists, academic freedoms in the region? Human rights goes much farther than just journalists. You were talking about freedom of expression in general. How does all this chilling effect, if I can use the word, affect all these other areas that are important for human rights activism? As I think would be entirely predictable, leads and has led to a dramatic closure of freedom in its many expressions, not just political freedom, but artistic freedom, cultural freedom, the freedom to expand new forms of thought, new thinking about women, new thinking about relationships, the nature of relationships, LGBT relationships, space that is necessary for any society to grow and evolve and develop and change, which, like any living thing must do, is stifled, repressed, and clamped down. And obviously, from studies that I've seen, it's also led to massive increases in depression, anxiety, suicide rates. The numbers for Gaza in particular are off the charts, in part because of the very broad military and political repression there.
There's also obviously the creation of a vast exodus, a vast brain drain from the Middle East. Those who are lucky enough not to be killed or not to be jailed, languishing in solitary confinement on bare concrete floors, like many of the former government of Egypt under President Morsi, including President Morsi himself, and have managed to get out. Are now living in exile, which is a tremendous loss, of course, for their countries, for their peoples, but also a tremendous loss for them. So it's I think, a key factor in continuing to hold back the natural, and what should be the natural evolution and development of these societies, and almost leads them to be stuck in time. And one of the biggest problems, of course, is also the education component, which is the level of censorship and control of academic freedom, not just at the university level, but even at the elementary school level, where, for example, we know that students are not even learning that there was a revolution in 2011, that there was a democratic election in 2011. An entire generation of Egyptian children are not learning about this.
Thanks. Courtney, in our business as journalists, we talk a lot about the word self-censorship. And most people think of self-censorship as coming always from the negative side, that people are being pressured and therefore they are careful what they write. But there's also what we call ihtiwa al-na'im, the soft kind of sponsorship where things are offered to you so that you don't write about certain groups. So in totality, how would you see and how do you rate the way this self-censorship is playing itself out in a media landscape that includes both the negativity of both the carrot and the stick to journalists?
Well, I mean, I think there is a very strong link between the overt censorship and the self-censorship. So certainly when you have the decimation of the community that helped bring about political change in the region, especially if we look at Egypt, the recent rearrest of Abdel Fattah, who already served his 5-year prison sentence, and even after getting out was required to report back every night to jail, amounting to another, prison census, and then getting put back on, in prison. We have the recent arrest of Abdel Fattah, another leading figure from the revolutions who was arrested on charges of spreading false news and abusing social media networks and is now on a hunger strike. We talk about numbers, but there are people behind each of these numbers, and these people have friends, and they're known in the community. They're known, or maybe were known. They won't be known to this coming generation, perhaps. But it sends a very strong signal when you can jail those people and pay no price. So that definitely has a self-censorship impact. But then you've also got this, of course, trying to avoid any sort of repercussions and then censoring yourself. And then the role, I want to bring in the corporate media role because it is a very different environment and media ecosystem than it was around the uprisings, when you had this creativity and imagination and people could imagine a different future and wanted to bring that about. Now you've got many fewer platforms. You've got some globally hegemonic platforms where you really need to be visible. And those platforms have to have a presence on the ground, and they have vested interests in accessing markets. And so now we see that these battles and these censorship battles are also being played out online with the additional vector of primarily American-owned Silicon Valley-based media outlets or platforms for dissemination. So you've got the Palestinian, both the diaspora and in Palestine, really battling to have their information stay online. We saw just in the past couple of weeks how so many Egyptian journalists and activists were silenced on Twitter when their accounts were closed and their content was removed. And Twitter's response was, oh, it was spam, or the behavior looked spammy, or it looked inauthentic, because they said, oh, they were using hashtags too much, or whatever it is. So then, you know, one activist described it as they censored themselves by using different words, and then even those words, because they were in Arabic, were censored. There's not a good understanding by these platforms, which are, again, based in California, about how to translate this information. You've got examples of journalists who rely on, for example, Facebook to get out information because there is not accessibility to independent media. Most broadcasters are state-owned in the region. Most print newspapers want to have an online presence only, or as well, and so, you know, they're really relying on these platforms to get out information. But, you know, one of my roles at the Committee to Protect Journalists is to talk to the companies when journalists get their accounts taken offline and try to find out why. And, you know, it just seems like so many times it ends up being, oh, there was an error. And this can lead to self-censorship as well, because these platforms are such important places where the narrative is playing out. And then, of course, you have the broader geopolitical battles between, you know, the Gulf and Qatar, and the influence that that has on journalists who, you know, now Al Jazeera is not accessible in the Gulf. You have to think about those dynamics. There, you know, again, with the Egypt example, there are concerns that there was some sort of political involvement in some of the hashtags and accounts that were taken down. You know, I was reading about the Assisi-related hashtag that suddenly disappeared. So no one knows why this is, because the companies are not open and transparent about their decision-making processes or provide any sort of independent auditing of the accounts that are taken down or the content that's taken down. So we just don't know about political manipulation. So, you know, this whole factor of things, and then you add into it new registration requirements, for example, in Jordan and elsewhere, where you have to license blogs or online news outlets that have over a certain number of readers. And so that also has a self-censoring impact, because a lot of people don't want to have to register with the government for a variety of reasons. And then if you choose not to do that, then you can be censored in that country and elsewhere. So there are there are a whole constellation of factors that are conspiring to engage in both outright and self-censorship.
Thank you, Courtney. I mean, the role the digital big giants are playing, not only in, as you said, bringing down some sites, but also they're sucking up all the advertising that used to go to local media, and local media is really suffering a lot. I'll add the name to your list of people that you should defend. Fadi Salameen, he's a Palestinian here in Washington, D.C., whose Facebook account has been brought down. He's been often critical of Mahmoud Abbas. I want to move back to the Gulf and to Saudi Arabia. Hala, activities of Mohammed bin Salman has been well documented in his role in Jabal Khashoggi, but I know many inside Saudi Arabia are not as negative towards him because of some of the reform he's done, not only about women driving, but also opening up cinemas, opening up cultural activities. I know in Jordan, the annual Jarash festival used to get a lot of Saudis to come. This year, a few came, and we asked why, and they said because they're having their own festivals now in Saudi Arabia. So there is an openingness to a certain degree. Does that change public opinion? Does that kind of whitewash or cover what else is Jamal has been doing, what else MBS has been doing in Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, I think this is very legitimate concern. What's happening in Saudi Arabia is very much largely driven by two factors. First, the need to find economic reforms in a land that has been for decades dependent on oil revenues, which has been really getting ahead since 2014, and especially now with the new strikes on the regional geopolitical outcomes from the engagement of Saudi in Yemen. So yes, the economy has been a triggering factor for reform. We cannot afford in Saudi Arabia to remain a country that is dependent on oil, more so because of the adventures and the aspirations of Mohammed bin Salman in the region, which buying allegiance, buying legitimacy in that case. is costly. The other thing is, the PR, basically presenting someone who's new to the power would require certain selling out of image, and the allies that he's seeking the protection from and seeking their support for his Vision 2030 to succeed are necessarily on a different cultural level. They're more open, they're more diverse and global in values than the traditional setting within Saudi Arabia. And to incite those people to invest first to support the new coming leader in Saudi Arabia and to invest in Saudi Arabia to increase the foreign investment inside Saudi Arabia would require certain reforms in the social setting as well. But the problem comes in the duality, whether citizens in Saudi Arabia are buying into these reforms. They are all attractive reforms that people within Saudi Arabia have been really seeking for decades, allowing women to commute, allowing them to travel, to be able to register their children in family records, also allowing more of a social opening without the fear from the repercussions of the religious police. But now comes the decency laws, this kind of uninformed policies, which doesn't really rely on honest reporting from the ground, has been backfiring at certain incidents. So you get to see on social media outcries from within Saudi Arabia on people reporting being fined for wearing shorts while exercising as Saudi people, or women dancing in one of those festivals while completely covered. And at the same time, comparing those incidents, the hypocrisy of having those, Saudis being targeted for engaging in those reforms while foreign tourists or reporters are allowed to take pictures in bathing suits and to dance and to have access to hotel rooms as partners without any documentation of marriage. So you get to see those things played out, and in turn, in Saudi Arabia, this kind of social reforms is very much like short-lived, and you need to have more of well-grounded reforms, especially if you are, trying to attract youth and to buy into youth. So the most important factors, and this has been like an ongoing, claim for so many years inside Saudi Arabia, is how to fend off unemployment. The rate has been very much like increasing, and you get to see people from within and outside Saudi Arabia are demanding more jobs, and this is the real deliverable of any reforms rather than this kind of fanfare of social reforms.
Thank you so much, Hala. I want to go back to Sut from University of Massachusetts in Amherst. When the Egyptian Sisi government had an Australian guy from Al Jazeera arrested on claims that he was Muslim Brotherhood, even though he ate pork and drank wine and everything else. But there was a concerted effort to get him released, while non-Western country journalists were not. And the Gaza situation, where journalists have been shot at, killed, and many have been arrested, barely ever make the media scene. So can you talk us about how the American media is covering these issues, and especially in the MENA region, and how has there been a role for the pro-Israel lobby in silencing some of the attacks against the allies of the U.S., as they call them, Israel, whether it's Saudi Arabia or others?
Yeah, I mean, the broad activities of the Israel lobby control, again, the context within which almost all of this takes place. I mean, it's very noticeable, I think, in the Great March in Gaza, where Israel has deliberately targeted journalists. I mean, deliberately targeted them. That has made almost no mention in mainstream American media. The only place I've seen it that's really been focused on it has been in independent media like Amy Goodman and Democracy Now! That focuses on it, because Amy Goodman actually knows something about independent journalism and knows what the role of independent journalism should be and what the role of journalism should be. In terms of the idea of self-censorship is, I mean, it's kind of embedded in how journalists think of covering Israel. What they have to think about is, am I going to tell the truth? Am I going to cover what's really going on and risk a call from my editor, risk getting fired? Or am I going to do the best that I can within the frame, within the opportunities that I have? and to, you know, and to do as much as I can. That's a very different way of thinking about what journalism means. In most of the rest of the world, if you're just doing the work of journalism, or if you're a dissident journalist, you have a chance of being killed. You have a chance of being tortured. You have a chance of being imprisoned to do your job, and therefore it takes, you know, enormous commitment to the moral value of journalism to do that. In the U.S., all that can happen is you'd lose your job. And therefore, once you go into mainstream American media looking at these issues, you've already made that compromise. And I think one of the reasons that, I'm speculating here, I think one of the reasons that there isn't a lot of focus on these journalists being killed in Gaza and around the rest of the world is that American journalists are embarrassed about what real journalism looks like in the rest of the world. And if they were to focus on that, they would have to pay attention to what they were doing and what they were not doing. And it's much easier, and they've already made the decision. They've already made the decision that they want to hang on to their jobs rather than do anything else.
Thank you. We covered in the first round the problem. We talked about silencing dissent. And now, despite all of that, we've had courageous journalists, courageous media outlets that have continued to fight. And I think, you know, we really salute these people. And the question now, I think, to many is how the narrative is being controlled. I mean, there are people who basically are unable to stop the news from coming out. But the problem is, what are we doing about the spin? Because the spin is sometimes making the news sound and move and look in a different way. And so I remember once in Jordan when they, in 2013, they blocked about 1,300 websites, including the one I was running, Amman.net. We kept on, there was a kind of cat and mouse game. We would change the domain name, and then a week later they would block us, and then we'd change it again, and so on. So I think there are people who try to fight the system. Some of them are forced to leave and live outside. Some of them continue to live in their countries. Some of them use pseudonyms. But I want to start again with Sara about Human Rights Watch. And what do you and Human Rights Watch suggest as the best short, medium term, and even long-term strategy that can be used to deal with this reality? How do we not only give people a voice, but also make sure that their voice is not being spun in a different way?
Well, I mean, the answer I have, of course, isn't limited to the confines of my work or outlook from Human Rights Watch. Although for the short term, I think continuing to act as a support of exposing and documenting the reality of what's happening on the ground in the Middle East and North Africa in particular remains vitally important, because the value of truth and the value of affirming the truth for people who are experiencing brutality, repression, may well be the only justice that they see in their lifetimes. I continue to believe in the short term is extremely important. And I would not indict American journalists that broadly. A number of American journalists, some of them people I know, some of whom I've worked with, have died covering the conflicts in the Middle East, have given their lives knowing they were putting themselves in a war zone to document what was happening on the ground in Syria and Libya, to name just two places. I think the journalists at the New York Times have done a phenomenal job keeping an eye on what's happening in Egypt, to give just one example. In the medium term, I think that the broader community of people involved in work in the Middle East should think about supporting and investing in the future of the Middle East by supporting and investing in the exiles from the Middle East who are scattered in many parts of the world, including the United States, but other parts of the world, cut off from what they know, their families, their livelihoods. And yet, the reason they're in that situation for many, if not most, is that they were committed to democracy and freedom and rights in their countries. They, I think, are the best hope for developing in a future for the Middle East. because one day, hopefully, they will return to contribute to their countries. And I think they can contribute to their countries now by serving as honest journalists, by serving as honest critics, and serving freely in whatever capacity they have. Finally, I think, and this is probably the most difficult piece of it in terms of the long term, is how to invest in the education of Arab youth. Because as I started my remarks by noting, they are being deliberately de-educated, miseducated, in terms of knowledge and information, not just about what's happening in their country at a particular time and moment by the repression, censorship of the news, but in terms of having a historical understanding of what's happened in their countries, and also an understanding of the values and concepts and practices of what democracy means and what human rights means. And so I think it's hugely important for, again, all of us engaged in this area of the world to figure out how to deliver that knowledge and education to the youth of the Arab world. What does democracy mean? What does free speech mean? What does terrorism mean or not mean? And finding a way to get that information to them is probably going to be the next challenge for many of us to work on.
So you're hopeful. You sound a bit optimistic, no?
Of course.
Good. Courtney, you think journalists have become more adept at circumventing government restrictions? Does CPJ provide digital safety courses to journalists? Have they been successful? Have you been helping them to kind of avoid all these restrictions?
There are a couple of different ways to answer that. So first off, the surveillance apparatus and technologies are so sophisticated and so advanced. It is very challenging to keep up. There was the report about the Raven, which is a new technology, a surveillance technology where you don't even have to pull it in, right? So with the spear phishing attacks, most of Pegasus was delivered by clicking on a link, phishing, or some sort of other kind of pull technology. You had to do something. But now there are technologies, surveillance technologies, and it looks like also the WhatsApp, vulnerability, as well as Raven, the pull technologies, are push technologies where you don't even have to do anything. All you need is the phone number of somebody or the email of somebody. So how do you protect against that? It's very, very challenging. We definitely do provide cybersecurity and digital security guidance and advice to journalists, including doing basic things like use two-factor authentication. A lot of the hacking and surveillance of journalists is not using the most sophisticated technology and taking a few simple steps like turning on two-factor authentication, using a password manager so you can use long passwords, wiping your devices if you're going into a sensitive area or crossing a border or anywhere where you think your device might get stolen. That sort of thing we definitely do, but it's really challenging to think about what people can actually do to keep themselves safe against these very sophisticated technologies. Furthermore, the information ecosystem is one of both information control and drowning out of those independent voices that are trying to circumvent censorship or circumvent control. So, I mentioned computational propaganda, state-sponsored trolling. They are hiring in many countries in the Arab region and also around the world, bots, botnets, armies, cyber armies. Sometimes this is part of the security apparatus. Other times they are amateurs or volunteers. And these are being deployed around the region to target those dissenters or oppositional voices so that they try to delegitimize them, or they try to drown out, their voice online. They're also using manipulation of the algorithms in order to silence, efforts to get something to trend, or again to bypass that information control. And sometimes they're doing this with the assistance of Western and American firms. For example, McKinsey created a list of social media influencers in Saudi Arabia who were against, one of the state policies, and then Saudi Arabia used that to target those users, and some of their accounts were taken down, some of them were imprisoned. So there is a range of tactics that are being used, and it's very difficult for an individual voice to bypass these state-executed or directed or incited computational propaganda campaigns. So it's not so much, so they're both trying to control the information from getting out to begin with. Once it's out there, targeting and intimidating those people and journalists who are expressing themselves or trying to independently report online, or drowning out the conversation entirely. And then, of course, we don't know what sort of pressure is being put on, the companies behind the scenes. Meanwhile, you've got this complete abdication of leadership by, some of the countries like the United States that have typically been there as an ally for some of these journalists. And so you had this revelation by A.G. Sulzberger, the editor-in-chief of the New York Times, or the publisher rather, who revealed that the U.S. did not warn Declan Walsh, their correspondent in Egypt, that he was about to get arrested, and a diplomat had to warn him on the side. And I would just respond, to the criticism of American journalists. I think that's way too broad, having worked as a journalist in the Middle East and in the United States for the New York Times, and in Lebanon, Egypt, and Dubai. I think that you have to look at the individual level of the journalists and what they're trying to do and what sort of stories they are getting out. And everyone has a different fulcrum on which they balanced. The Daily Star had its own way of looking at the conflicts there. The Al Arabiya, we had, pretty clear guidance on how to cover, the Iranian Revolution in 2009, but otherwise we're relatively open to cover what we wanted until they fired you for covering the wrong story. And then at the New York Times, again, they have a different fulcrum from where they balance. And part of that is based on who you perceive as your audience. So I, have lost friends. I have friends in jail who are both American and who are local journalists. And I think it's important to pay tribute to the people who are on the front lines and who are reporting in very challenging situations. And it's not just war zones, it's reporting on women's rights. It's reporting on the environment. There are journalists in jail, in Saudi Arabia because they were reporting on the women rights campaign. So, across the board, journalists are putting their lives and their livelihoods on the line to try to report.
Courtney, some immigration officials and police, including the U.S., ask journalists and others to give them the password of the Facebook. Is that legal? Are you supposed to oblige to that? What can you do if you say no? They'll kick you out?
So this is a huge issue, and actually started under the Obama administration, where we saw that the Department of Homeland Security was targeting journalists who had been reporting in Arab or Muslim-majority countries, especially with terrorism issues, where they were pulling them out for secondary screening and asking to see their devices. Borders are kind of like rights-free zones. It's very unclear what rights you have at the border, and we have definitely seen journalists who have not wanted to give access to their devices, turned away, and not allowed to enter the U.S. if they were not a U.S. citizen. Sometimes they're able to push back. For example, I think it was Maria Habib, who worked for the Wall Street Journal, who said, you've got to talk to my outlet's lawyers first because these devices belong to them. But if you're a freelance journalist or you're, an independent blogger, it's very tough to not give up that information. And now DHS wants social media profile information, and they have also retaliated against journalists and individuals who have information on their social media that the government somehow doesn't like. So at this point, it does seem to be legal, but there are a lot of things that our Department of Homeland Security are doing that are severely problematic, and including keeping databases of journalists reporting on the migrant crisis, which we think they probably were doing the same sort of thing of journalists reporting on terrorism. Otherwise, how would you know to target them for secondary screening? But the problem is, again, so much of these issues have to do with transparency and accountability.
Yeah, when American president calls the press the enemy of the people, it resonates around the world, unfortunately.
Yes.
We're about done. We have two more commentaries. If you have questions, please start writing them now and get them to me so we can immediately move into the second stage. Hala, are the Saudis, journalists and non-journalists, able to bypass or overcome these restrictions? Does eroding space for critical research and writing affect what they're doing? Are women's rights activists able to write and engage in media, even though their books are being prohibited by the state and by the religious authority. Do you see some kind of positive signs there of people bypassing these restrictions?
Well, I think the problem is not in bypassing it. I think the problem is in the, this kind of out of law, or basically the law becomes the regime. So it's not like again, to the problem of having regulations with catch-all terms. Also, the problem is you're not bound by any kinds of written law, as a journalist or as a campaigner or as an advocate for certain human rights or a blogger. Your job is actually information, disseminating information, forming networks of people, building this kind of relationship over years with, if you're an activist or a scholar, to pass the information to correspondent journalists or people who are on the ground for years. I mean, that could be very much like criminalized, and it's very selective in nature. Not everyone is targeted, but the most prominent voices. So I don't think the problem is in regulation per se, because regulation has never been specific and has never been respected in terms of political will. But in the targeting of people without any kinds, outside, the rule of law. And itself, that is very much limiting. We've seen that in, the 14 demands that, the coalition countries have demanded from Qatar. On top of it is Al Jazeera. We used to write for Al Jazeera, so as scholars and activists. We used to write about issues without any kinds of political problems. But once the decision to blockade Qatar, or to basically stop any kinds of engagement with Qatar, has come to effect, all of the people who used to contribute has been retrospectively, basically, been targeted, despite the fact that none of us have been informed of any kinds of problems in writing for any kinds of media outlets. One of the charges against the women activists is their engagement with the media at large. So it's not about having to protect yourself, even if you have very legitimate communication with, with fellow activists, with media people, when issues that are not considered any kinds of national security. That could be basis for your targeting. So I don't think it's about having a secure engagement with your constituencies or people. It's more of this kind of out of law practices of the government in the region.
Thanks so much, Hala. I want to end with a kind of a bit different. I want to look more into the U.S. scene, and we've talked a lot about the Arab authoritarian governments using various legal methods to restrict speech, attempting to muzzle contrary points of view. But we know that that's not limited to the Arab world. In the US, despite its First Amendment, issues like Palestine, like BDS, have been singled out as an attempt to kind of muzzle and stop people from expressing themselves. So can you give us a short view of how this First Amendment is being abused in the United States? And is there a crack? You think there is some cracks happening in the pro-Israel lobby, in the Israeli control of the narrative as far as Palestine is concerned?
I'm trying to think how to do this in a short frame. Obviously, the efforts by the Israel lobby to control the discourse has gone through many different frames over the years. At the moment, the most important is, they have weaponized anti-Semitism. And so any criticism of Israel is seen automatically as being anti-Semitic, and it's very difficult now to separate out those two things. And so that's the major kind of silencing mechanism that's being used, because no one wants to be accused of being a racist. No one wants to be accused of being anti-Semitic, and therefore it's easier not to say anything. We've seen how this is happening here. We've seen how it's happening in the UK as well, in which there's a major effort to stop any kind of criticism of Israel, of Israeli policy within the Labour Party, based precisely around this notion of anti-Semitism. So that's the major way that frame is being adopted right now. And certainly there are cracks in this discourse now. And we know we just can look at the Democratic primary and look to see how the candidates are talking or not talking about it. I mean, not one Democratic contender went to APAC this year. That is a major change from the past. And I think we have to give credit to people like Bernie Sanders, who has used his power to introduce something new into the discourse, although even he is responding, of course, to activism on the ground. He's responding to what's happening within the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. And I think because of the primaries going on right now, that there is a small crack, I think, in the Democratic Party, and that has now become highlighted more and more. And the more it becomes highlighted, the easier it is for people to speak about it. So I think we're in the situation now where the control is very intense still, and around accusations of anti-Semitism for talking about these things. At the same time, more and more people are speaking out. And I'll just end with one brief concrete example. Last May at the University of Massachusetts, I organized a panel or an event based on, it was called Not Backing Down. And it was about the backlash against pro-Palestinian voices and how more and more people are not backing down. And we had people come to this event and people said, you know, I've been to hundreds of events and normally they involve 2 or 3 or perhaps 10 people who come to these events. The event we had 1,600 people in it.
Wow.
And that would not have happened
Wow.
even 3 years ago or 4 years ago. And something I think something is changing. There is a crack, and the question is whether you can push that crack open and make something significant out of it.
Even the presidential candidates are now speaking out a bit more, no? I've noticed more than ever before. At least there's some opening.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren are talking about conditioning aid to Israel. That's never happened before. Right? I mean, in terms of the cracks in the discourse. So even though, I mean, I tend to focus on these broad structural issues, and it can be very depressing looking at them, but there is, you know, when you do that, the broad analysis, you do miss what is also going on in the cracks as well. And I think we're in a place where there is a major crack that is developing.
Thank you so much. I'll start doing the questions, and I'll start with Courtney. Lamia El-Far says, Courtney mentioned this significant crackdown on free speech in Egypt, in particular with spike in jailing journalists, etc. But Egypt also seems to champion higher participation in entrepreneurship activities with supporting SMEs and so on and so forth. Under these conditions, she goes on and on, but basically, how do you explain the negative media coverage of Arab countries who are also allies like Saudi Arabia and Egypt? She concludes. So on the one hand, she's saying things are improving economically and they're helping the entrepreneurship, and yet she's saying there's a lot of negativity of media coverage of Arab countries.
I mean, I think that it is very challenging for businesses to think about investing in a country that jails journalists, that jails foreigners, and shuts down the internet, restricts information. We saw this in some of the responses by countries, for example, that were based in Egypt around the uprising, and seeing that they were willing to do a whole-scale shutdown for numerous days, and what that does to business. I mean, I think, you know, thank goodness for local entrepreneurs. You know, it's amazing the resiliency of the people on the ground under very challenging circumstances. But I think that, you know, it is those, you know, to use different form of cracks, it is those cracks. It's not a monolithic authoritarian system. There are always cracks. There is so much creativity, especially, you know, I spent a lot of time in Egypt and got to know a lot of people there, and the imagination, the interest in you know, imagining a different future. I think we see that in entrepreneurship, and I think I just want to read like 2 sentences or 1 sentence from a letter that Alaa Abdel Fattah wrote from prison a couple years ago, because I think that it's, you know, it's very important, because he was talking about, you know, how they succeeded in bringing about this change, but then they were defeated by the powers that be, because those people who bring about change are not necessarily the same ones who can institutionalize it. And he said, you know, but then we were defeated, and meaning was defeated with us. And since our defeat, whenever a complex issue has been raised, it has been immediately trivialized, so that understanding it has become difficult and action virtually impossible. And I think that it's those, you know, we do have to see beyond just the people on the front lines to see what is happening in the cracks. I think that there is never any turning back, although I'm very pessimist about the, say, immediate future. I think I have to try to share some of Sarah's optimism that I don't think that after the experience that people on the ground in Egypt had, that there is ever any going back. And you can see that in the really creative, entrepreneurial, you know, media and all sorts of other things happening there.
Thanks. Sarah, a few questions to you. Simple one is, how reliable is the annual U.S. State Department report on human rights? A bit more complicated one is about Lebanon. And Dr. Ghassan, thank you for raising the case of Lebanon. Please note that if you dare mention the head of Amal militia, Speaker of the Parliament, Nabih Berri, or head of the Progressive Socialist Party, Walid Jumblat, you'll be killed. So that was to you. Any comments on both?
In terms of the State Department reports, historically, I should say, I think they have been very, very good. And that is because of a strong tradition of independence of the State Department's Bureau of Rights and Labor, where the human rights chapter presenters reside and sit. And, you know, they're obviously a short survey report by nature, and they tend to be very limited in terms of presentation of facts without analysis, certainly without any questioning of the U.S. support for a variety of the governments that, you know, the abuses of which are documented in the U.S. State Department reports. I know that the chapter on Israel-Palestine has always been the most difficult and the most contentious for them, and that is because of the very close ties between the U.S. government and the Israel lobby, which, you know, monitors and surveils what the State Department says on Israel very closely. So a lot of caution there. To be honest, I did not review this last year's report.
We'll have Seth answer that. Don't worry.
Yeah.
But Lebanon.
Lebanon, you know, I mean, I don't think it's true yet, because people have been criticizing them, and if you look across the streets of Lebanon, you'll see plenty of criticism of those two gentlemen, and even more other gentlemen behind them in the streets, and so far there haven't been any fatalities. I hope that remains the same, and I wish we could say as much for the protesters in Iraq, where, you know, it's, well, of course, of Syria, but as in now, as in today, as in this week, in the past 2 weeks, over 250 youth have been murdered on the streets of Iraq.
So, in addition to the human rights report, Isaac from the American Prospect writes, earlier this year, the New York Times inadvertently revealed that its in-house style book forbade journalists from referring to Gaza as occupied in 1994. I'm not sure it's true, but when Israel was occupying Gaza, can you address this in light of your defense of U.S. media, or whoever defended U.S. media?
Sorry, could you repeat that question?
Nobody defended U.S. media, but that basically the New York Times tries to water down the term occupation as the human rights report actually took it out totally. One more point, Rula, PR consultant, as mentioned, U.S. media are guilty of self-censorship. Example, U.S. journalists not being able to humanize the Gaza residents during the 2008 conflict. Is there a true free press anywhere in the world? So basically, U.S. coverage of the media, the word occupation, whether it's in the human rights report or whether in the main corporate media.
Well, of course, there is a major conflict over whether you can even say the word occupation anymore. I mean, the rest of the world talks about occupation, and the Israel lobby has tried to say, well, you can't use the word occupation anymore. It's something else. And so this kind of, lexical struggle has always been going on. I mean, there were also reports. CNN a few years ago sent out a memo saying that you could not refer to to settlements as settlements, but they were now communities.
The neighborhoods, they call them.
Neighborhoods. A neighborhood is just a nice, everyone lives in a neighborhood. And so this kind of, this close lexical control, you don't see it very often, but sometimes, what's the best way to get information out to an organization? You send out a memo. And sometimes these memos get out and you can see exactly how the control of language is used.
To Hala from Dina Khmeri, the Tadamun. There are many goals of MBS's Vision 2030, including diversification, physical reform, employment. How do we hold MBS and the government accountable via media for these changes when there is a gap between projected goals and enacted reform? And to you, Hala. And what is the role of non-government institutions, i.e. Saudi Aramco, with influence during these times of reform?
Well, I think, so yes, there are so many. We have to remember as well that these, objectives of the Vision 2030 have been very much used also in the campaign to promote the economy or the economic opportunities within Saudi Arabia, both to domestic and to the foreign investors. But again, I think the problem in accountability, how do you hold the government accountable under an absolute monarchy? I mean, if you don't have an independent media, if you don't have a parliament, if you don't have freedom of expression, which is very evident, it is very difficult to have the transparency that you need to access to information. Today, figures, when it comes to unemployment figures, is very much difficult to attain. So how can you basically create this kind of public awareness, first to access those kinds of actual figures and information, and second to have them disseminated or campaign at least in the court of the public opinion, if not in reality. As for the NGOs in Saudi Arabia, they're very much working as charities, so they're very much encouraged as well as part of reducing the public spending. So charities are very much encouraged inside Saudi Arabia, which has been historically a domain of the government. So the government has been sponsoring all kinds of charity work or organizations and have been presenting them in international platforms as NGOs, which is not true because they're not independent, and second, they're not engaged in public affairs per se or the public debate on contentious issues. They're very much related to service provision. So, for instance, giving financial or some kind of limited resources to the impoverished or needy, groups. There are some groups who have been really making some kind of a progress, like Mawadda organizations. It has been successful in building relationship, and this is a very, very interesting area as well. Because of lack of regulations, there is no definitive regulation that decides or dictates what is allowable and what is prohibited inside Saudi Arabia. It has provided a venue for people who are working in more or less safer places or places which are needed by the government to somehow forge some kind of existence or a presence on the ground. Like Mawadda, as I said, Mawadda organization works with the divorced women in order to reform divorce law, procedural law mainly, not the substantive law. So basically expedites the proceedings of a certain case in court, providing women with some kind of legal support, engaging with officials in the Ministry of Justice or with the lawyers community, in order to educate them more about the main structural problems within the Saudi legal system. So it has been making a progress, very limited progress, because it's not substantial again, or it's not in the removal.
Saudi Aramco and also the Yemen war.
Yeah, Saudi Aramco has been very much a venue to promote. It's now functioning very much like a way to promote the skills of the Saudi youth, which is very much needed. But then the problem comes in this kind of limited vision to youth as economic assets, and this has been actually mentioned in the Vision 2030, the reference to youth as economic assets. So yes, the government wants people who are skill-savvy, people who are skilled, who are well-trained, but well-trained only to mobilize the economy, or basically make sure that the economic needs are met, not necessarily as engaged or informed citizens, which is the problem. So most of the initiatives of Aramco are very much geared towards promoting the image of Saudi Arabia abroad, bringing people from outside of Saudi Arabia as ambassadors to sites within Saudi Arabia to have some kind of experience with elites, and very much like tailored and crafted visits within Saudi Arabia to go back to their own countries and build this kind of networks, more or less like the US maybe outreach programs. But it is very much limited on the scope and on the actual impact on youth. So I wouldn't really talk much about that. The
Yemen war, has it
very much
affected
like,
internally?
Of course.
Discussion, debate, media?
No, this is one of the most problematic issues, because people who have Jamal Khashoggi, who has been at the beginning very much like welcoming the initiative of intervention of Saudi Arabia under the pretext of coalition and under the control of an international UN target, basically, or supervision, to intervene in Yemen and to make sure that the legitimate government has been restored, to curb back against the Iranian influence, or to create this kind of civil wars. Once the war has progressed into the worst human-made crisis, Jamal Khashoggi has changed his opinion, has been very much providing the classic case of what happens to people who are taking this kind of a stand. Of course, you can't really sense how people feel under authoritarian government, such an oppressive government as Saudi Arabia. You can never sense, if what you're seeing online or in the print media actually reflects what people think. And even the self-censorship, which has been mentioned, people are now learning to basically say what's safe enough when they are asked by foreign visitors or foreign journalists.
Thank you. Sarah, 2 questions for you. One from Safi Hamid, the Clear Center for Egypt-American Relations. Since the only element of the population left who can criticize publicly are the immigrants and expatriates, what can Human Rights Watch and similar organizations do to support them in front of the threats of authoritarian governments? And from Faris, also Egyptian-American kid, how do we push a regime to create a constitution? I believe that conflicts are seizing power before using a solid agreement to enforce, I can't figure this out, but to really reform the constitution, basically. He's asking, and the other one is saying that Human Rights Watch should support the immigrants in expressing themselves.
Well, I mean, I guess I would say we indirectly try to support the exiles, the political exiles from the region. A number of them work for Human Rights Watch, as well as various other human rights organizations, so we directly benefit from their knowledge, experience, and relative freedom. But I think the kind of support that I was describing earlier in terms of a medium-term plan would take the organizational capacities and resources of different from what Human Rights Watch has. We're actually, particularly the MENA division, very small. I tell people, and they're often surprised, we have one person who works, one researcher who covers Egypt at Human Rights Watch, so we wouldn't have the capacity to provide the sort of support and investment that I was describing. I didn't really understand the second question.
Okay. Courtney, sensational journalism. What can we do, succeeding freedom of expression, what can we do about sensationalism, and how do you create an informative, educational dynamic of journalism? And somebody else asked a question about, do you believe education without employment opportunities or proper infrastructure in the MENA region is counterintuitive to the limiting of extremism? In other words, that it basically encourages extremism.
Just a few small issues to deal with there. Okay. I mean, I think that ultimately it's up to journalists to decide, and media outlets to decide what their editorial approach is going to be. And one of the key factors that you need to ensure that there is also good journalism is independence and pluralism and freedom. You need to be able to work safely, and we need a pluralistic media environment where you have different types of media that are based on different types of funding mechanisms. So whether that's private advertising, whether that's subscription, whether that's nonprofit, whether that's public interest, state-funded media, because you need all different types of media. Some journalism is going to aim at sensationalism, but I get worried about talking about how to put on editorial controls when the fact is we really need more journalism, I think. I think one of the things that really struck me about living in Egypt and studying the media there was, how little local journalism there was. I think there are some very interesting hyper-local initiatives, and I think there's a great promise for local news and improvements and investment in local news to combat some of the sensationalism. But also, this issue of language, I think, is really an important one, and I do want to take a second just to address that, because I think we can fixate on things about what one word is used. I think it's interesting. I've noticed that Palestine is used more often as a term, and I think 10 years ago we didn't see that in American media very much. And the other thing is, every news organization has a style guide. At Al Arabiya, part of what we did with the wire copy was Arabize it. So we would change terms to be more, interesting and relevant to our audience. So I think we want to keep things in perspective. And also that journalists, are always trying to find the most neutral and least biased way to describe something. In fact, my old boss, Rami Huri, is somewhere in the audience from the Daily Star, but I remember my first ever op-ed, and first thing I published in the Arab media was called What's in a Name. It was trying to think about the least biased way to call the Israel separation barrier, and I don't know what we're calling it now. That was many years ago. But I think that we need to be careful with broad brushstrokes, and in terms of addressing sensationalism, you can choose where you get your news, where you click, where you subscribe, and if we want to have good, straightforward news reporting on interests that are relevant on issues that are relevant to us, then we're going to have to pay for it.
Thank you. There's a big new genre coming up in journalism called solution journalism, and a lot of journalists are now rethinking the whole concept of journalism. We have 5 minutes, and if everybody wants to speak for 1 minute, I'll allow it. Otherwise, I'll conclude. Sarah, anything?
I think I probably
You pass?
overspoke my quota.
Sat? Courtney? Okay. So we had a nice discussion, I think. Did you want to say anything else?
I'm good.
Nope. We had a nice discussion on the issues of controlling the narrative, silencing dissent, media politics, and freedom of expression. I urge all of you to stay around for the 3:30 session on cyber, geopolitics, and the weaponization of social media. Jessica Dare, Deputy Director, Ranking Digital Rights. Ryan Grimm, DC Bureau Chief of The Intercept. Karen Gullo, Analyst and Senior Media Relations Specialist in Electronic Frontier Foundation. Mark Owen Jones, Assistant Professor in Middle East Studies Digital Humanities at Hamad bin Khalifa University, and moderated by the only Tamara Kharroum. Thank you so much for attending.
This is nice. I'm flying
Hello, everyone.
west.
We're going to get started, so if you want to get a seat. Thank you. Thank you all for staying around this late in the day.
I have we'll see what comes out. I have
This is going to be the most exciting discussion of the day, the best panel,
Naturally.
of course.
Yeah, exactly. Best to last, etc.
Best for last,
Yeah.
indeed. Cyber geopolitics and the weaponization of social media.
Actually taking the thing.
Hello, everyone. My name is Tamara Kharoub. I am the Assistant Executive Director of Arab Center, Washington, D.C., and a Senior Fellow. It is a pleasure to be here to round out the day's discussion with this panel on cyber crime, cyber war, cyber geopolitics, and the use of social media as weapons. Some housekeeping reminders for those of you who are joining us just now. Please remember to silence your phone. If you have a question, please use the question cards in front of you and raise your cards so our staff will pick them up. And finally, we encourage you to engage with online using the hashtags, hashtag Arab Center 2019 and hashtag Arab Media. And now back to our topic, cyber geopolitics and the weaponization of social media. Building on the conversations throughout the day, this panel will explore the evolving use of social media platforms and new technologies in the political sphere. With the emergence of cyber power, opportunities and risks are presented by new media tools. In the last few years, we've seen those tools used in the political arena, from cyber activism and online mobilization on the positive side of these uses, to espionage, fake news armies, hate speech, and cyber warfare. How are social media platforms and new technologies used and manipulated as tools of war and propaganda? What are the humanitarian costs of cyber conflict? What is the future of human rights and democracy in the region in an increasingly interconnected world? And what policy recommendations and regulations can best counter the misuses of technology and cybercrime laws? To help us understand these phenomena and answer these questions, and probably more questions, we have a great panel of experts this afternoon. I will briefly introduce them in speaking order. Mark Owen Jones is Assistant Professor in Middle East Studies and Digital Humanities at Hamad bin Khalifa University and a Fellow at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter. Karen Gulo serves as Analyst and Senior Media Relations Specialist at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Ryan Grimm, who will be joining us shortly, is the DC Bureau Chief for The Intercept, and Jessica Deer, who serves as the Deputy Director at Ranking Digital Rights, and she's also the co-founder and Executive Director of Social Media Exchange, or SMEX. Their full bios are available in the program book. They all have great accomplishments that we don't have time to go through right now. Each of the panelists will have about 12 minutes to present their remarks, after which we'll take some questions from the audience. Again, please use the cards to write your questions. I would like to start with Mark. Mark, how is propaganda in the Arab world evolving with social media tools? And more specifically, how are fake news armies and Twitter bots changing the political sphere? And I know you've studied specifically the GCC crisis, among other things. How did social media impact the geopolitical dynamics in that context?
Thank you for the, hello. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me here. It's great to be in DC. Despite the 14-hour flight, I'm still jet lagged. This is probably my 8th cup of coffee. So I can't be held responsible for my actions. Kidding. Yes, so I'd like to start by talking about some recent news. Yesterday, Twitter announced that they were banning political adverts, to which I say, who cares? And I had this discussion with Karen earlier. Not going to make the slightest bit of difference. All the examples I'm going to talk about now are forms of manipulation, disinformation, fake news that have no bearing on political advertisements. However, they do point to the fact that all sorts of the malicious use on Twitter in the Middle East happens regardless of any political advertisement laws. So I want to start really by saying a little bit about what I do, and then giving some empirical examples, because I think we've been looking a lot at high-level facts here, or high-level issues of the media in the Middle East, and I want to give some pertinent examples. So in addition to some of the other things I do, I describe myself as a bot wrangler, bot wrestler, troll wrestler. I'm one of the people who actually who tries to find or try and prove that these troll and bot armies exist. So you've heard a number of the speakers talk about the various methods of intimidation and harassment, such as trolling and bots. But how do we know they're there? We have to know somehow. We can't take Twitter's word for it. We can't take Facebook's word for it. So what I've done over the past few years is been looking at the rise of largely automated accounts that masquerade as real people in the Arabic-speaking Twitter sphere. And these accounts promote specific discourses, almost exclusively state discourses, on Twitter. The idea being to promote a specific message and drown out another message. So I want to start by giving a couple of examples. I first noticed this phenomenon back in 2016. I was writing I'd finished my PhD writing on political repression in Bahrain, and I noticed that there was in Bahrain at the time, there was a cleric called Isa Qasim, who was living in the village of Daraz, which had been surrounded by police for some time. Eventually the police raided the village and arrested him, and they removed his citizenship. What happened then online was that lots of accounts, ostensibly different in individual accounts, started posting messages like, oh yes, Isa Qasim is a Shia terrorist. It's good that he's been arrested. And then at one point I just saw multiple identical tweets from different accounts, and I thought, okay, this is very strange. So I started downloading data from Twitter, and I started seeing thousands and thousands of tweets that were maybe five different tweets, but repeated thousands and thousands of times by thousands and thousands of different accounts. So obviously this was suspicious. So I started pioneering a way of finding that a lot of these tweets, these Twitter accounts, were created on the same day and were tweeting about the same subjects. And they were tweeting in a way that was regular in similar patterns. So it was obvious after a certain point that these anomalies pointed to a automated set of accounts that were tweeting essentially, in this case, anti-Isa Qasim propaganda, and also anti-Shia propaganda. So when I started pursuing this more and more, I found that this network of thousands, and this we're talking about hundreds of thousands of fake accounts at this time, were producing information that promoted a certain Saudi news channel, but also was promoting sectarian hate speech. So these tens of thousands of accounts were producing millions and millions of tweets every week promoting a sectarian discourse. So it became very interesting to me that a lot of the kind of information that people were seeing on Twitter, if they looked at certain keywords, because these accounts were tweeting across different topics, from the war in Yemen to Saudi politics to what was going on in Iran, would have been confronted with kind of very virulently sectarian and oftentimes anti-Semitic rhetoric, all produced by some software code that was promoting all these accounts. Now this was very crude. It was a very crude operation. And this is where my cynical relationship with Twitter began. I had all this data, and I said, okay, well, I knew someone in Twitter I'd met at a conference. So I sent them this report and said, well, here's some data. And they said, thanks, we'll get our team to look into it. I wish they did. And then they got back to me saying, oh yeah, thanks, we suspended 1,800 accounts for spam-like behavior. I was like, well, you know, that's good. What about hate speech? And I then published that on my blog, and then they got annoyed at me because they said that wasn't for public consumption, that information. I was like, well, you didn't say it was confidential. So I became very aware at this point that Twitter were very sensitive about having this kind of information broadcast. And this is, again, why I'm cynical of Twitter, because the things they say, the things like we're banning political advertising, it's relatively meaningless. And we do not know, and this came up, I think, in Courtney's talk, there's so little transparency about what social media companies do and do not tell us. We really do not know the scale of the disinformation being produced in the whole world, but we can at least say there's a certain amount of scrutiny happening here. You have Zuckerberg being hauled in front of Congress. But in the Middle East, it's a new frontier, it's a Wild West. There does not appear to be any desire for transparency or accountability in the region, which to me makes the problem of disinformation and fake news on social media platforms far worse. And, you know, it doesn't end there. There's a couple of other examples that happened after this that, again, made me question the seriousness of Twitter in tackling this problem. I'm going to tell another anecdote that I think is quite telling. I did an investigation into verified Twitter accounts. For those of you who don't know, verification is a form of Twitter acknowledging that you are the person who that runs that account. Twitter do not say that they endorse that person. But what I started noticing is there was a account called Gloria Steiner. Now, the name Gloria Steiner might not mean anything to any of you. It might mean something to some of you. It's a verified Twitter account, but the banner headline was like a really kind of patriotic Saudi flag with loads of pro-Mohammed bin Salman tweets and just thousands and thousands of tweets praising Mohammed bin Salman. And I was like, and the name of the handle was Gloria Steiner, but the name of the account was like Abdulaziz or something. I was like, that's strange. I was like, Gloria, if that is your real name, why are you tweeting so much about Mohammed bin Salman? And this was a verified account, so I thought, this is odd. So I downloaded all the verified accounts on Twitter, which you can do by downloading the followers of the verified account, because Twitter verified account follows all verified, methodology. But so I went into it, and I started looking at accounts, and there was a lot of them. There was about 330,000. And I identified a subset of accounts that all appeared to be run by people who they didn't claim to be. So not just Gloria Steiner, but one of the most telling examples was a guy called David Schwartz. For those of you who watch the Weather Channel, you might know David Schwartz. He was a weatherman who passed away 2 years ago, sadly. He had an obituary in the New York Times, so he's a well-known person, at least in the USA. He has an obituary in the New York Times, and his account had been hijacked at some point by a Saudi-based entity that was promoting Saudi propaganda. This account had tweeted pro-MBS tweets and tweeted the time of the blockade anti-Qatar tweets. So this is very strange. So I wrote up this investigation where I documented several verified Twitter accounts promoting this disinformation, after which Gloria Steiner and a couple of others had the verification status removed. I was like, fair enough. But to this day, and I think now, I mean, I could be wrong, but I checked last week, Dave Schwartz, although his photo has now been removed and his profile picture has been removed, his account still is verified and the handle is still TWC Dave Schwartz. And I find this phenomenal because it makes me wonder, there's different explanations, like Twitter don't know about this, in which case I think there's a certain degree of negligence on their part about how their platforms are being used in the reason. They do know about it, they don't care, which is possible, or they do know about it and they can't do anything about it, which again I think is another reason to be kind of worried, because another aspect of what we've been talking about is not just, we've been focusing a lot on regimes and states and their propaganda, but what we need to be mindful of with companies like Twitter and the other companies that have been mentioned before that aren't social media companies, NSO Group, is that repression is increasingly the work of not states or regimes, but assemblages. We're talking about entities that include states, but also commercial actors, Silicon Valley, surveillance companies that act together and act with each other to perpetrate these crimes. You know, it's like when you look at a weapons company, we have arms controls for a reason. And we also view those arms companies with some, kind of judgment when they sell their wares. And we should be the same with social media companies. But we need to be increasingly mindful that these companies are treated with a kind of kid glove approach. We do not demand, I think, the same kind of transparency and accountability from companies like Twitter and Facebook in the region that we'd expect from other companies, and we need to start doing this. We need to know more about the country-level agreements that companies like Twitter and Facebook have with, say, the government of Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates or Egypt. Because if you can have your platform operate in these countries, then there needs to be some sort of accountability in terms of what they are able to do and what they do. So there's plenty more examples that I could give, and I'm happy to talk about in questions or afterwards. But I just wanted to start with those two things because I think they're very interesting. And what they show us is that these platforms are manipulated in such a way to produce the kind of false illusion of civil society that promotes like Middle Eastern regime propaganda using these Western platforms, and in a way that is done with little censure in the region. It's a kind of Wild West of social media, as I see it. And as far as I can see, the problem doesn't seem to be going away, or it does not seem to be abating. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Next, we have Karen, and speaking of holding tech companies accountable, Karen, can you please touch on the issues of the dangers of mass surveillance and the breaching of privacy rights, but also how freedom of expression is different in the cyberspace and this tricky balance between free speech and hate speech?
Sure. Can you hear me? First, I want to say thanks for inviting me to this forum to talk about these important topics. I want to tell you a little bit about Electronic Frontier Foundation, in case you don't know. We are the leading nonprofit defending digital rights and online free speech on behalf of technology users. Since 1990, EFF has been championing user privacy, free expression, and innovation through impact litigation, policy analysis, grassroots activism, and technology development. And we're a donor-supported organization. The majority of our funding comes from ordinary individuals, and about half of that money comes comes in the form of donations that are under $10,000. So I think that a lot of what I'm going to talk about will touch on this inherent tension that there is between wanting to rein in hate speech, extremist speech, that is no doubt doing a lot of damage around the world, but also the concept of free expression and the need to retain an internet that allows for free speech and free expression. I mean, the internet is where everybody goes out and goes to speak and give their views and watch cat videos and find community and friends and criticize, parking fines and presidents and bad movies, kings and queens and prime ministers. It's also a place where people go to challenge authority and call for protests and street marches and advocate for change. And what we see is that free speech online is under attack in the United States and around the world because there's increasingly laws and policies that are controlling access to the internet, censoring speech, and invading online privacy through surveillance, like you mentioned. And that is a mechanism to chill speech and silence voices, especially those of journalists, activists, dissidents, racial and religious minorities, LGBTQ communities, and other marginalized groups that have a hard time being heard in the first place. So when we look at adopting laws and principles and policies to rein in hate speech, you have to think of the other side of the equation, and that who else is going to be swept up in those kinds of regulations and laws that are supposed to be stopping hate speech. And I think that it's not as clear-cut as everyone might think, and it's something that we really need to keep in mind. Right now, one of the biggest debates about online speech in the U.S. centers around the question of whether internet platforms and websites should be liable for the speech of their users. The posting of online violent images and extremist creeds has a lot of people focusing on technology, on the delivery mechanism, and there are a lot of calls that websites and platforms should either do a better job of removing the material, or they should face regulation that is going to hold them responsible for it. Right now, U.S. law provides websites with immunity for user-generated speech, and by that I mean, speech on sites that is not directly created by the websites themselves. I'm talking about, comments and Facebook comments, posts, reviews, emails, and things like that. Without this law, which is called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, the internet as we know it would not have flourished. The law has allowed social media platforms, cloud storage providers, online marketplaces, blogging sites, ISPs, and email providers to host speech without having to worry about ruinous lawsuits that will crop up for things that people disagree with or things that someone thinks is defamatory, and so on. And it also allows internet platforms to create the rules that they feel like they need to control speech on their websites. I'm talking about like content moderation policies and so forth. Section 230 does not protect internet sites from criminal and civil liability when they've had a direct role in creating the content at issue, or where they're otherwise liable, or where liability is otherwise based on the company's own actions. My colleague, EFF Legal Director Corinne McSherry, was invited to testify at a congressional hearing about Section 230 earlier this month. And as she explained to US lawmakers, she said that expanding liability on online platforms for what users say would just incentivize companies to over-censor user speech in an effort to limit their legal exposure. Voices will be silenced, there's no question about that. And then dismantling or weakening Section 230 would further entrench the big tech players because they're the only ones that could withstand the legal costs of, of increased liability. And smaller startups and companies, social media companies that could be the next big thing for online speech wouldn't be able to risk the legal exposure, and so they wouldn't be able to exist. And less competition means more power for the already powerful and fewer outlets for users to practice online speech. So we see laws around the world that are affecting the ability of people to be able to speak out freely. Cybercrime and counterterrorism laws passed by governments in the Arab world to combat fundamentalist groups and protect national security are often used as a mechanism to stifle unwanted or politically critical speech. An EFF report on speech crackdowns in Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Tunisia found that protecting the homeland from the threat of terrorism has become a primary justification to shut down unwanted or politically critical online speech. And there's sort of a pattern in that, the authorities identify, the offending online activity, and then they find law, whether it's a law aimed at journalists, like a publications code, or a cybersecurity or counterterrorism law that's aimed at speech, and they and you'll find that political dissenters, journalists, and others will be silenced. They'll be imprisoned or worse, and that's one of the things that I'm trying to emphasize is that efforts to try to rein in speech that is hateful often encompasses speech that people just don't, that governments just don't want people to hear. As far as hate speech goes, governments and tech companies have been pursuing strategies to eliminate hate speech that have the unintended consequences of censoring important speech. Bans on hate speech end up corralling not just hate speech, but legitimate efforts to report on hate speech and extremism. We worked with the Syrian Archives and the organization Witness on a report published in May that shows how faulty moderation inadvertently captures and censors vital content, including activism, counter-speech, satire, even evidence of war crimes. Automatic flagging, algorithms, and hashing are used to identify and take down terrorist images. But caught in that net are thousands of Syrian YouTube channels that were publishing videos documenting human rights violations in that country. The terminated social media accounts ranged from documentations of protests in Syria to non-traditional media reporting on violent attacks that did not incite violence or encourage dangerous activities. And similar examples can be seen in Yemen and the Ukraine. Journalists like Egypt's Wael Abbas, who has posted documentation of police brutality and other human rights abuses, has for years experienced censorship at the hands of YouTube and Facebook and all of the Silicon Valley's top companies. His photos and postings have been caught up in this net of opaque and shoddy terms of service and lazy algorithms. So I think I'm running out of time, but I wanted to point out that EFF has been documenting instances where platforms have cracked down on online speech too broadly and have silenced a lot of legitimate speech. We have projects called Tossed Out and onlinecensorship.org. And these track the shortcomings of sloppy content moderation. And we're trying to motivate platforms to modify how they're reviewing accounts. We also back what's called the Santa Clara Principles, and these are a set of just minimum standards that we think that social media companies should be incorporating, that where they were required to be more transparent about what they're taking down, why they're taking it down, who motivated them to take down. For example, was it a government flagging or what have you? And then also require them to give users a chance to appeal those decisions and actually have human interaction in trying to appeal them, so that their takedowns are not just arbitrarily done and speech removed from the web. I'd be happy to, talk about or give out the URLs for all of this information that I've given, and I really appreciate the time and your attention.
Thank you, Karen. And moving on to Jessica from Ranking Digital Rights. Just building on that, I think social media companies have tremendous power in terms of controlling information and policing information. And we've heard some advocates call for either government regulations over social media companies or asking those tech companies to play a larger role in policing speech, both of which are problematic. What is the policy solution?
Thank you.
In 10, 12 minutes.
in 10 to 12 minutes. Thank you, Tamara, and thank you for having me here today. I guess I kind of wanted to start in a slightly different space, but I promise I'll get back to
Sure.
your question. And sort of listening to Mark and Karen, and also to the previous panel where Daoud Kuttab asked sort of what's the long-term strategy as we sort of deal with all of these problems that we're confronted with. And I think sort of the key difficulty in your question right now, Tamara, is that we're all struggling even in our so-called democracies with this idea of what do we do with what I think of as sort of an algorithmic public sphere. And what do you do when you have to layer that also on top of sort of the types of repressive and restrictive policy regimes that we see across the Arab region? And so going back to this question of sort of what's the long-term strategy, it's a question that I and my partner, who is Mohammed Najm, who is the executive director of Social Media Exchange right now and is in Beirut and at the protests daily, have sort of discussed at length, is like what is the space that we have, and what is a theory of change in a region with so little sort of public space? It's a very difficult kind of problem, and what I keep seeing in tweets from Twitter as people continue to go to the streets in Lebanon is one of the themes that is emerging is that we're reclaiming our public space. For those of you who maybe have never been to Lebanon, there is really not a whole lot of public space. There's not a lot of public parks. There's the Corniche in Beirut. Perhaps in places outside Beirut, there's maybe a little bit more public space, but it's largely, most of it has either been sort of privatized by corrupt interests. The coastline is owned. And a lot of, it's been paved over and developed, and so people really struggle with having a public space. And so there is this sense that people are meeting in parking lots and convening to sort of talk about what should be the way forward, which is, giving a lot of people a lot of excitement about what is perhaps possible. And we're all sort of waiting to see. But this idea of reclaiming public space or reclaiming sort of the public sphere, I think is something that we should be looking at on a regional level, but also on a global level, because we're all using these same platforms. And our public sphere is sort of becoming like, if we're restricted by legislation and the application of that legislation in more repressive regimes, we're also being restricted by the algorithms that are sort of underlying that public sphere. I now work at a place called Ranking Digital Rights, and Ranking Digital Rights is a program that's based in the New America think tank just up the street here. And what we've been doing over the past 5 years is producing an index that provides sort of a detailed, ambitious, but achievable, we think, roadmap for companies in the internet, mobile, and telecommunications sector to improve their respect for human rights online. And the way that we've done that, we say that it's a ranking that we produce, and we have used the Universal Declaration of Human Rights framework as well as the Ruggie Principles, which is the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, to create a set of indicators that measure companies on their disclosures and public commitments to human rights. These indicators are divided into governance indicators, free expression indicators, and privacy indicators. Because, as we've said many times today, free expression is a fundamental right that is sort of a gateway right to pretty much everything else that we want to do if we're organizing online. And within free expression, we're starting also to look at access to information, which is incorporated in the right to freedom of expression, but also under threat with the algorithmic sort of ecosystems that we're looking at. And I think we have to also sort of start thinking about privacy in the same way that we think about freedom of expression, privacy, and personal data protection, because this is sort of the way that people are being targeted. It's the way the speech and advertising, targeted advertising in particular, are sort of helping to produce these kind of rabbit holes of disinformation or hate speech. The things that we engage with most are sort of being promoted because of their more extreme views. They're sort of promoting these more extreme views, and that this is creating not only sort of the proliferation of what some people might call sort of negative externalities of the business models of these platforms, but also preventing people from getting information that they really need in a deliberative democracy. So I guess it's not very good news to say that not only are we contending with sort of the legislative and policy space that we have been talking about all day in the Arab region, but we're also contending with sort of the companies and the lack of transparency that they have around their policies as well. So let's see. And I think, if you don't mind, I'll kind of leave it at that. I mean, there are some things that we can talk about in terms of what some of the policy recommendations might be. Oh, I know what I was going to also talk about is that, so I guess there's the way that we're sort of, or way I'm sort of thinking about this now, and sort of this idea of what's the theory of change, and that there's sort of, I don't think we can expect government policy, legislation, revising constitutions to have much of an impact. I think we have to look for what are the other levers that we have available to us. People definitely, and the protests that we're seeing in Iraq, in Lebanon, Algeria, Sudan this year, and elsewhere, I mean, they're definitely important, but they certainly can't be the only they can't be the only actor. And I think one of the things another thing, and Jamal Khashoggi said this in his last interview, which has already been referenced today, but one of the things that was really striking to me is that he sort of said one of our only hopes is if the international community actually stands up and holds the governments accountable for the rights that they have, in many cases, either signed or ratified as signatories and ratifiers of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so, but they're not, and they're not because of this idea of sort of sovereignty of states, And so I think there are questions that we need to really, difficult questions that we need to ask ourselves about what does sovereignty mean in a digitally networked age? Can it really exist as the same kind of concept, especially when we're talking about information ecosystems, which are sort of fundamental to everything that we do? And then the third area that I think we need to think more clearly about as a lever for change in the region is using the business and human rights frameworks. I'm really struck at how I have a real sense of cognitive dissonance when I look at the level of investment that's taking place both from Silicon Valley into the region and from the region, particularly the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund, for example, into Silicon Valley companies, and there's really very little scrutiny of this. You have editorials, and then you also have problems, for example, where we all hear about China and how China is asking companies not to remove Taiwan from their country list, or the recent problem with the NBA and how there was support expressed for Hong Kong and freedom in Hong Kong. But we never hear about the fact, we don't hear enough or in any sort of depth the fact that Netflix removes its episode critical of Saudi Arabia from that geopolitical market or that geographic market. We don't hear about Snapchat removing Al Jazeera's channel from Bahrain and 2 other Gulf countries. I can't remember what they are at the moment. iTunes also removed one of their third-party sort of store providers removed songs that they considered critical, although they were actually anti-terrorist sort of thinking songs, because they were worried that they wouldn't be accepted within the legal regime. And what a lot of these companies are doing is using sort of compliance with local law, which does not conform to human rights standards, as a justification for this, because they want to operate in these markets. Not to mention the fact that very few of these markets have anything resembling a data protection law. And so there are questions there about how can you operate according to human rights standards if you're operating without data protection law. Of course, that also happens in the United States. So, but just basically speaking, I think like this idea of using business as a lever and sort of giving more scrutiny to how investments are flowing. I mean, we see in the Saudi Vision 2030, I mean, I think I want to emphasize that these states are thinking very long term, and I don't think that we're thinking long term enough to match them. They're thinking 2030, the Emirates is 2071. They're thinking about becoming huge market makers, and they're thinking about technology investment and military investment as replacement for oil investment, and they're using those revenues. And I think what's going to end up happening, what I'm concerned about, is when I see these small little incursions into our policy space of things being removed, I'm worried that this ends up, when we knit our digital economies too closely together with regimes that do not share human rights values and democratic values, that what will end up happening is those policies, that the bar will be lowered for everyone. And I think we need to really look more closely at that digital economy space, but make sure that we include the human rights with it. It's not just about development.
Thank you, Jessica. We'll start collecting questions. If you have any questions on the cards, please raise your questions and the staff will pick them up. I just want to mention that Ryan Grimm, unfortunately, will not be joining us. He had an emergency and he is not able to be here. He apologizes. I would like to follow up with a question based on what you said, Jessica, to start with. So we've seen this mutual interest relationship between the private tech companies and the authoritarian regimes, especially in the Arab world. Is there a need for an international mechanism to hold both entities accountable? And that's the question for the three of you.
To hold, can you repeat the question?
An international mechanism or an international agency dedicated to this issue to hold both governments and tech companies accountable?
I'm really reluctant to think, there's a conversation going on in the United States right now about whether or not we need an agency for the internet and sort of to help, I don't know, monitor, govern digital space. And I'm really reluctant to think that that's a good idea. I think siloing digital in its own sector is an idea from 2 decades ago. I think everything is digital now. I don't know how you think of what's a data company, what's not a data company when everybody's collecting data. So I'm sort of instantly allergic to the idea of an international agency trying to like manage the space and hold accountable, especially given that many of our international institutions can't hold states accountable anyway. But I do think that we could sort of try and maybe affirm that that the human rights that we've set out 70 years ago now, and I think there's a reaffirmation that needs to take place, and I think it's, you know, I see so often in government sort of positioning of the internet as like we're trying to make people safe and secure online and we're trying to grow our digital economy. But there's really not very much space for sort of thinking about how do we ensure a deliberative democracy? How do we ensure the values of deliberative democracy? It's always sort of like we want to be safe in digital economy, but of course we want to protect freedom of expression. But so I think there needs to be a reaffirmation at the international level and also among democracies that this is, you know, that we believe in these are the values we believe in. We believe that they should exist in the online space, and that we should use, frankly, the international human rights framework that we have to hold companies accountable. And I think companies should adopt the international human rights frameworks for their content moderation policies and their policies in general. And that doesn't necessarily preclude, you know, also having the First Amendment, but it as, you know, maybe a more expansive policy, but it definitely sets a baseline for what should be, and prevents this idea of complying with local laws that are fundamentally at odds with human rights and democratic values.
Okay, and I will follow up, and I'll give Karen and Mark the chance to answer this as well. It's a related question from back at Columbia University. Kind of a suggestion, I think, as well. Do we need a cybersecurity convention to standardize norms around cybersecurity issues? And it's a similar related question. Karen?
Well, I think that I was going to talk a little bit in my time about the Christchurch Call, because in some ways it has a similar theme. So essentially, in the wake of the mosque shootings, the New Zealand government basically released a plan to combat terrorism and online violent online content called the Christchurch Call. I don't know if you recall, but the massacre was intentionally live streamed and disseminated on social media, and it was really an incredibly dark moment for Facebook and for all people, I think. And so I think that so the call calls for there to be some consensus around how to remove online hate speech and violent speech. And about a couple dozen countries have signed on. U.S. has not, citing freedom of expression and freedom of the press issues. But it basically calls on governments to commit to, you know, strengthening the resiliency and inclusiveness of society. So in some ways, it gets at trying to address why there is hate speech and why there is, you know, calls for violence. I think that a lot of times we look at technology and we, you know, because it's the delivery mechanism, we're looking at technologists and companies and government laws that would dictate to them what they should and shouldn't do as the answer, when it would be nice to see there be a lot more focus on sort of the social and cultural issues that are leading to these kinds of, the tolerance of hate speech. We have a terrible problem with that in this country and I think in other countries as well. So, I have my doubts about whether, there could be any kind of, international body or even an agreement, as to what should be encompassed in that. And there's one example that I would also give, here at the U.S. because there's there are a lot of proposed bills that are coming out of Congress that are trying to get at this whole idea of internet censorship and whose voices are being silenced online. And some of these proposals are basically at the very core of what they are would put the government in charge of deciding, what is acceptable speech online. And I mean, it just goes against everything in the First Amendment. So I think that if we were to go down that path, there'd be a lot of really bad ideas that would come out of it.
Mark, would you like to address this?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm generally in agreement with what Jessica and Karen have said. I mean, I do, however, think, there's a bit of a paradox. If we say that certain international bodies or regulations wouldn't be effective in combating these things, then what harm does it have to have them? Well, maybe they would be effective and it would be harmful. But at the same time, I think we need to reevaluate how we perceive social media companies, in my view. I think there's a normative assumption that things like Facebook and Twitter fundamentally are somehow this good and useful platform that are being misused. Well, what we have to do, I think, is just actually view them at how they're used in their context. Maybe in the US with the Constitution and protections of free speech, that's fundamentally a good thing. But increasingly in the Middle East, they are a platform, a delivery system for propaganda and misinformation. That doesn't mean that they're not used for people trying to use them for freedom of speech. Of course not. But at the same time, what is the context that they are used in the Middle East? I would say increasingly it is a very detrimental manner in which they're being used. And I think you could have more corporate accountability on how these platforms are utilized. I mean, the examples were given of how, Netflix removes the show, the Patriot Act, because it doesn't comply with Saudi law. And then, yes, Saudi laws are not in line with lots of human rights laws that they should be. Why are social media companies that are headquartered in certain countries allowed to operate in countries that have been, aren't party to certain human rights agreements, have a track record of human rights abuses, and have a woeful record on freedom of speech? Why is that allowed to happen? I mean, because that's something you could probably legislate on a domestic level. So even before we talk about the international kind of aspect of it, why can't that be done? You could expect a certain amount of due diligence from these companies before they're allowed to operate in other countries. There's a campaign now to get Twitter MENA removed from the UAE. UAE has a terrible record of treating its dissidents and stifling free speech. So why can't we address that problem? Just as we have conventions to regulate the arms trade, again, many of which are kind of circumvented and laws are subverted, but they exist. We're talking about the weaponization of social media. The word weapon is key. We can't use that word and not talk about things like arms, right? It's the same problem. So yeah, I think there can be some sort of legislation, whether on an international level or a domestic level, that could actually force companies at least to be mindful of the situations in which they operate. And we can't just assume that these tools are somehow good and we should let them do what they want and then maybe have these other caveats. No, we need to actually see how they're being used and then legislate accordingly.
Thanks. And speaking of weapons, we have a question from Dakota from Georgetown. How does attribution and misattribution of cyber attacks by governments, for example, impact regional relationships? Does anyone?
How does it what?
Attribution and misattribution of cyber attacks impact regional relations and conflict.
Oh, that's a goal. That's a.
Well,
anyone would like to try that?
That's an Emirati Gulf.
I mean, I could attempt to answer that quickly. I mean, I think what we saw certainly in the Gulf crisis in 2017 was that the Qatari government accused someone of hacking its new systems. eventually there was multiple competing claims about who was behind it. Initially, I think some US intelligence operatives said it was the Russians, then the Egyptians were mentioned, and then the Emiratis, and then the Saudis were mentioned. So I think misattribution or deliberate misattribution or tactical misattribution is designed to kind of follow along existing policy lines. So I think if you accuse someone of hacking, your news company, you're already in an acrimonious state with that other party, right? So I think in the context where we know these attributions take place, they already follow foreign policy like lines. So I don't necessarily think it's too untoward or particularly controversial. But other than that, yeah, I'm not entirely sure to us.
Anyone else? Okay. We have a practical question from Kathleen Davy Mystery, I believe. Is there a list published online that gives people interested a list of what media is allowed or prohibited, social media specifically, WhatsApp, Twitter, etc., in Arab countries?
I don't know of any list. It also changes relatively, I mean, maybe not as frequently as it did sort of immediately after the revolution and during the Syria conflict. For example, before the Syria war, sort of like around 2011, I think, when it first started, it was interesting. One of the things that Syria did was open access to Facebook, and a lot of people assumed that was because they wanted to sort of be able to monitor conversations, and that's a tactic that's been used. I don't know of any lists that actually, but there are, sorry, I'm trying to get back into the directory of my head that says there are tools. One of them, I think, is Herdict, if I'm not mistaken, that will allow you to test whether or not, and other sort of measurement tools that will allow you to test whether or not a site is blocked in a certain country, but it doesn't work for all countries. It depends on whether or not the people who run the site, and I think that's the right one, but I'm not sure, actually have access to a server in that site and can do whatever the technical sort of pinging that needs to be done to see if sites are up online or not. Yeah, I don't know of any comprehensive list that does that.
I think Citizen Lab, they were looking at what was being filtered by NetSweeper, which I believe was a Canadian company, which filtered at certain websites. So I think they started curating a list of sites that were blocked in specific countries using NetSweeper.
Yeah, I think Citizen Lab is where they used to have like we've worked with them on something like that before, but I don't know if they actually post like lists.
Yeah, I don't know if it's real time or updated.
Yeah.
There are some. Often these kind of things, in my experience, are on a country by country basis, and it's often activists who are keeping tabs of these lists. So it's, if you're interested in a specific country, you have to tap into the activist network, and you'll probably find it. I know with Bahrain, it was always used to be on this kind of old school style blog where they'd keep a track. They keep a track literally of things that you couldn't access.
All right, we have a couple of related questions about state and non-state actors getting involved outside of their own states, especially through social media. And there's a question about disinformation campaigns by China and Russia around the world, but also specifically whether we've seen that happen in the Arab world as well, and especially in places like Libya, Yemen, Syria. Mark, do you want to start?
Sure. I mean, we know that there's been Russian disinformation active in Turkey, Syria, and to an extent Libya. But attribution is also a problem here. I think that there obviously is Russian disinformation. I think we tend to have, there's an assumption often, and I think it goes back to the Cold War paradigm of how we view international relations, that if there's some sort of sophisticated or even crude cyber attack, either the Russians or the Americans or the Chinese must be involved. And maybe there's some expertise down the line. But I think what was interesting about the Gulf crisis, what it showed us is that with the kind of massive assemblage now of private security firms, entrepreneur hackers out there, it's very easy for states to get hold of people who have these expertise, who are willing to work and conduct either hacking operations or propaganda operations on behalf of a state. So I don't think it's always wise to be looking at state-centric actors in this sense. I mean, what we saw certainly in the Arab world, and although I cautioned against relying on what Twitter say to be a barometer of the level of disinformation, recently, about a month ago, Twitter dumped loads of what they said were political spam accounts. They dumped about 4,500 accounts that they said had been promoting various aspects of propaganda. And I looked into it, and you know, most of these accounts had been criticizing the Iranian role in Yemen, criticizing the Houthis, criticizing Qatar, also sort of promoting the Saudi line on the Jamal Khashoggi affair. But the majority of these accounts were at least based coming out of the UAE, right? Which again, as I mentioned before, is where Twitter MENA is based. So there's a certain amount of irony there. So I think what we have to do is although we have to acknowledge that, you know, Russia does play a role, and it certainly probably plays a role in providing some expertise in these levels, we need to maybe focus less on the role of things like Russia and China in this sphere, because I think there's a lot of in-house or in-regions activity that's kind of doing this. I mean, to go to the Russian example, I mean, one of the most pertinent cases was Sudan recently. There was the M1, which was a mining company that was, CNN saw documents that this company had sort of gone beyond their remit of looking into mining, and was basically promoting a campaign that sought to discredit the protest movement by saying it was against Islam, they were pro-LGBT, and that they were violent, which is the classic kind of tropes. So we do know that there's very strong evidence to say they are existing, but they're certainly not the only player in the game. And I think if you're looking for Russian influence in these disinformation campaigns, you've got to look at Russian trade interests. We know Russian investors are looking increasingly more into the Gulf, both in terms of selling their missile systems to Saudi, but also potentially investing in Aramco. I think it's logical to say where Russian trade interests go, their disinformation goes, because they attempt to, one of the tropes of the Russian disinformation campaigns in media, in Africa in particular, is to discredit rival powers, whether it's the US or the French, right? So this accompanies their kind of trade campaigns in order to push out, or at least discredit a lot of their potential rivals. So I think it's a perfectly plausible thing, but they're not the only players in the game.
I would just quickly add, and again, that this idea of just looking, I mean, I think there's something that also goes on where, so there was a revelation, was it early last year, 2018 in January, of a sort of a Lebanese state-sponsored, we think, sort of attempt to create clones of apps that people would have on their phone, and sort of like, and so instead of downloading WhatsApp, you got a link that was sent to you like, hey, download this app, and it would go to something that looked like WhatsApp or another application, and you would download it, and your phone is owned after that. And Lebanon, basically, we think, from the report, which was actually produced by EFF, is that public?
It is.
Okay, sorry. You know, like in the basement of General Security, apparently there are some people, at least that's what the geolocation of the IP address said, like, you know, there's this small state, Lebanon, who is sort of testing out what its like surveillance capabilities are, because these tools are so easy to get. You have, you know, you hire some people who have good hacking skills, you pay them, they create these things, and they had collected information on people from, I think, I can't remember the exact numbers, but 80 different countries.
20 different countries.
20 different countries, maybe, you know, I think several hundred individuals.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, it's not just Russia and China or Iran. You know, their aspirations are kind of contagious to smaller states who have also been introduced to organizations like Hacking Team and others, and sort of have these aspirations of also being able to conduct this sort of activity and surveillance. And so it is that we need to think. I guess the point of all of that is that it's not, I don't know what the point is, except that like this does happen, and it's small states, large states, it's not just sort of the usual suspects, and so there are things that we should be thinking about on a more fundamental level that requires us to sort of protect our public sphere in a way that I think we're sort of missing the point sometimes.
If you want more information about that Lebanese example, our report was called Dark Caracal, and you can find it on our website. It was done by EFF and researchers at a firm called Lookout.
Okay, we have a question from Elizabeth. She says most current discussions about digital rights and censorship are pretty elite or niche. How do we get this knowledge to a wider audience, including the vulnerable people? And I would add to that maybe a question of how these disinformation campaigns have kind of distorted the notion of what is fact and what is truth online. And for the consumers, it's become very difficult to distinguish. And I would like to ask you to further ask you about the issue of media literacy. Do we have enough media literacy among consumers of social media?
So the last part was about media literacy, and the first part was about
how these discussions are elite somehow.
elite, okay.
To get
So-
this
and
knowledge
how
out.
do you get the knowledge out? So no, there's not enough media literacy. There definitely needs to be more media literacy, but I think, so I've worked in the development space for a long time, media development, where money comes from rich Western governments into sort of development organizations, media organizations, journalist organizations in my region, in Lebanon, the Middle East. And, there's a lot of potential good that can be done, but then also, it's never enough. So, and it's usually when you're talking about media literacy for adults, let's say, it's probably a little bit later. I think this is something that should be integrated into sort of elementary education from a very early age, but it's only one piece of the puzzle. Just like fact-checking, of course we need fact-checking, but it's only one piece of the puzzle. We're never gonna solve what some people might refer to as a disinformation crisis through fact-checking. And on the disinformation piece, I think one of the questions that I continue to have is, what are we aiming for? What are we actually trying to achieve in the disinformation space? Is it the elimination of disinformation? Is it, I still am not clear on a lot of the efforts regarding disinformation, which I think often gets ascribed to social media and the internet and not to the actual people who are creating it, which are sometimes often states. I think there was a report recently on 70 disinformation campaigns that were run by states or people who are very closely aligned with states, political parties, and others who already have political power. So that's kind of so in terms of getting it out to people, I think yes, they are very elitist discussions. However, I think what I've seen is that, for example, the WhatsApp tax in Lebanon that has sort of sparked, not the reason for, but has certainly sort of sparked the current protests. A lot of the ways that people are responding is by holding digital security clinics and helplines, and so these moments of organizing are often very good times where you do see the spread of this information on a peer-to-peer basis. It's not something that can really be architected necessarily by the development community, although probably some of those people who are passing this information along, you could probably trace back to the source of some of these kinds of, digital activism or digital safety or digital security kinds of trainings and things like that. I really think there's no better way to spread this kind of information than for people to be organizing themselves and need it. So it's often in reaction to something like that. It creates a critical moment.
Karen?
Well, I agree that the discussions can be elitist, and there does need to be more done to involve people of all communities. At EFF, we have a somewhat new organization, a part of the organization called the Electronic Frontier Alliance, which is goes out. It's communities around the country outside of the big, the big media centers, and the aim is to try to get more communities involved in, digital rights and advocating on the ground in a grassroots way for digital rights. I think that when it comes to some of the arguments that we tend to make about how fighting hate speech and other kinds of speech ends up having consequences on marginalized communities, that's it's sort of with that in mind that we advocate for a more measured approach, because there's been a lot of hue and cry about who's is it conservatives, is it who's getting kicked off of Twitter and who's getting there's a certain I don't know. There are people who can always find their audience because they have the resources and they have the mechanisms to just move from social media to some other social media platform, or to television, or to radio, or but that's not true for a lot of people in communities that are trying to use the internet to stay in touch, form community, educate themselves. And so the arguments or the debates about whose voices are shut down, I think there's not enough of attention being paid to the fact that it has a tendency to affect people who don't have the power to find another way to be heard. And I think that's especially true on the international front when you're talking about areas of the world where Facebook is the internet. I mean, Facebook is the way that people communicate with each other. It is the way that news is disseminated. And when you're getting your, news reports, or your, like I talked about before, your, videos that are providing, evidence of war crimes, when you're getting those shut down, it sends a terrible message, and it's very unfair, uneven application of censorship and content mediation.
Mark, would you like to add?
Yeah, I mean, just briefly, when I worked for the NGO Bahrain Watch, I mean, I do agree there's high-level discussions of things like digital rights, but they do transfer down. But the thing is, it needs to be well-resourced. It needs to be context-dependent. How people use the internet in one country or platform in one country will differ vastly from another. Again, when I was Bahrain Watch, we did a lot of work when we got funding, and this is another issue that, the elephant in the room is like, how are these initiatives funded? We did a lot to try and raise issues about the dangers of using Twitter. But then we also found that the problem is one of the things that was celebrated about such platforms is allow people to communicate. And once people become more aware of the dangers of them, the trust that is necessary in any deliberative democracy, if that's what we're talking about, also vanishes. So there's also downsides to some aspects of media literacy and how we use certain things. But I would say it does happen. In my limited experience, I suppose, working with an NGO, though, it can be very under-resourced, and it's reactive. Jessica mentioned Lebanon. The things that will be happening in Lebanon now will be different from what happened in Bahrain or Tunisia 5 years ago. The issues, the technologies will be different. The tactics being used by the regimes to control them will be different. So you constantly need someone or some group of people who are adaptive in reacting to these situations, and that requires some degree of resources. And often the people, if it's not just activists doing it, often people doing it are, they're getting funding from NGOs. It's pretty scarce and limited and temporarily kind of restricted. So I would say that this is something that can be resourced more, and it does exist. It's just sometimes it feels like an uphill battle, I think.
And speaking of evolving technologies, I will just pose the last question, and then I will let you add what you like. And this is a topic that Ryan Grimm was supposed to talk about, so I would like to make sure that we touch on that a little bit. And it's the issue of cyber war. And whatever that could include cyber attacks, cyber espionage, surveillance, and so on. How worried should we be about the future of the Arab world with new advancements in technology? And feel free to add your closing remarks.
So I'll say I think we should be very worried, because I think a lot of, going back to sort of what I was talking about in the Gulf, in my opening remarks is that the Emirates is sort of, and Dubai in particular, is positioning itself as sort of like the hub of smart cities development, for example. And, and I think it's in the Saudi 2030 vision, it's in an Arab League digital strategy document that I'm not sure is public now, but the Arab League put together a digital strategy, and everything is smart, 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 smart. And every time I see the word smart, I replace it with the word surveillance.
Absolutely.
And so that's very concerning to me. The fact that, like, I can't remember I could look it up, but the exact story. For example, in the Emirates, they're trying, traffic accidents are a big problem. People drive too fast, big cars, et cetera. And one of the things that they have also is sort of traffic cameras that are, observing people. They also have facial recognition on buses to sort of be able to monitor whether or not a bus driver is tired. But, when you realize also that in the Emirates, 80 to 90% of the people are migrant workers who have really very few rights, then you start to worry, what does that do to the marginal, how does that marginalize people further? And there was one thing with this said that they were using, and I can't remember what the technology was, but or probably some sort of predictive policing that had helped them detain 400 and something suspects, like at a perfect 100%, which we all know is just not possible. So this is sort of like really dystopic, sort of futuristic uses of technology. I think another thing that we're going to start to see across the region is the implementation of biometric digital ID systems, where they can very easily, without the right institutional protections and data protections and independent institutional protections and independent judicial sort of processes, you start to see people, that these systems can very easily be co-opted and corrupted for surveillance purposes and other sorts of oppressive tactics. So and the problem is that the international system is helping to implement these things. The World Bank is giving Morocco $100 million in loans to be able to implement a digital ID system over several years, but without thinking about what are the human rights protections there. And PricewaterhouseCoopers is writing the reports on it and doing the consulting. And so our problems are not really, in my opinion, at the layer of, sure, misinformation, disinformation is a problem, but our problems and what needs to be solved is really at a much greater layer, and will require us to ask difficult questions about what do we really value in life and in the world and in the societies we want to create, and what are we willing to question, like the sovereignty of countries to be able to abuse their people. So that's the dark side. And then to go back to the question, and I'm sorry that I forgot to say this before, on the media literacy and how do you spread this, there is a hopeful side, and it's probably still a very asymmetrical fight, but I just wanted to mention that my former organization, SMEX in Lebanon, has started hosting an event. Last year was the first year, this year is the second year, called Bread and Net, Khubz and Net. Like, so bringing back sort of this idea of the economic thing, but then also the networking part. And it's a 3-day conference that brings together people who are working, either digital rights activists or others who are sort of looking at Arabic content online. And speaking of Arabic, one of the things that makes this event special is it is in Arabic, which most of the digital sort of security kinds or digital kinds of events are not in the language of the region. And so Bread and Net is in the language of the region. There's English and Arabic, but mostly Arabic. And it's people talking about independent journalism, it's people talking about surveillance, about AI, and bringing all this together. And to my knowledge, it's really the only sort of place in the region where this kind of event is happening in a social justice and human rights kind of context.
That's good to know. I agree with a lot of what you said. I think that the technology holds great promise, and it also has really done us in a lot of ways. And I think that I think that the problems that the Arab world is facing are the same that we've faced here, and we haven't fixed, or we haven't done a good job of protecting people and giving users more rights over their digital lives. I think that that's sort of where things should start. And, I don't think that these tech companies and social media companies, I don't think they have enough experience in the Arab world. I don't think they know enough about it. I don't think that they know enough about the language. I don't think that they have enough expertise or people consulting them, and they certainly don't have, to my knowledge, enough input from civil society and human rights organizations in order to help them balance the obvious pressure that they are getting from governments and regimes to, censor certain kinds of speech or disallow certain kinds of people, or to use their own platforms, using these platforms to target speech that the governments don't like. So, and absolutely the surveillance technologies, whether it's facial recognition, the biometrics. I think Dubai is the first, and Emirates is the first airport and airline that's going to be using facial recognition as a means for check-in. These are, so the technologies that, these are sanctioned it's a sanctioned system by the American Customs and Border Patrol. And, I don't think anybody knows where those scans are going, or how long they're going to be kept, or who's going to have access to them. And I read I was reading some reports about it, before, in preparation for this talk, and what I saw was that when asked about, well, do you know how long these images are going to be kept? The response was, well, this is being done under the auspices or with the help of the CPB, the Customs and Border Patrol. And I just would argue that that wouldn't give me a lot of hope, or that would be something that I would find a bit alarming. And so I think that the more that countries have unfettered ability to influence tech companies, and the more that tech companies allow themselves to be influenced because of the riches that they could garner from being in the region, it presents a problem that must be addressed.
Thank you. Mark?
Yeah, I'm generally more cynical, as you might have guessed. But I think I'll speak more to disinformation, I suppose, and propaganda and controlling the narrative. But one of the things, obviously, that we have to bear in mind is the delocalized nature of much of this disinformation. As Jessica and Karen mentioned, countries like, the UAE are positioning themselves, using their vast amounts of wealth to position themselves as a lead player, not just in creating smart cities, but creating a surveillance apparatus in collaboration with the Israeli companies, for example, in order to not just probably spy on their own population, but to export that capability around the world. What I see on social media is that, unlike, if we look at the evolution of media ownership models from having newspapers that were generally more national-centric to satellite channels that were then regional, We saw countries like the UAE and Saudi buying up the satellite infrastructure in order to help dominate the message, kicked out BBC Arabic, for example, because they didn't like that they had the power to do that. Now what? I mean, we see, at least the second largest shareholder in Twitter was a Saudi prince. We see, again, that was mentioned before, SoftBank, Saudi investments in Silicon Valley. But if we actually just look at the operators of the platform, I've done now a study of Twitter users in the Arabic Twitter sphere. If you look at the amount of all verified users on Twitter, the vast majority are in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. If you look at the amount of content produced by Arabic language news accounts or accounts that market themselves as either a news account or a journalist account, the vast majority, by a huge amount, is Arabic language content produced from accounts that have a location or inferred location in Saudi Arabia. And so what we have to remember that's key about the Arab world, whilst not everyone's Arabs, and these countries are different, Arabic language is still, and Fusha, modern standard Arabic, is still spoken across lots of these countries. So if you're a country that is able to dominate the dissemination of information in a specific language across a specific platform, across a specific region, and you're not bound by borders or other information controls, you in theory have the ability to project your influence beyond your borders. And if you're a country that is fundamentally authoritarian, censors its own press, and has a kind of toxic foreign policy, and then you're exporting that, that is a huge problem. And we've seen that. I mean, and I want to end now just with one example, because it relates again to Jamal Khashoggi. Is I did a study on, in October, the October when Jamal Khashoggi was murdered, I decided to look at every Arabic country that had Twitter trends and to see whether Khashoggi's name was mentioned in all of those countries, right? So the idea being that, well, if his name is trending in one of these countries, it's a bit like having a newspaper headline. At least it's getting some sort of prominence, right? So I counted, I can't remember, it's 8 or 9 Arabic countries that have this Twitter trending ability, and I looked at an archive of Twitter trends. And I found that the country where Jamal Khashoggi's name was mentioned the most was Qatar, which is not surprising because this was the Gulf crisis, and obviously the Qatar, Al Jazeera was using this instance to kind of highlight how authoritarian Saudi Arabia was. Yet the country it trended least was Saudi Arabia. And some of you may be like, well, maybe Saudis are too scared to tweet on it. But Saudi has the largest Twitter population in the Arab world. But what's more is when I actually looked at the content of one of these hashtags, Jamal_Khashoggi in Arabic, about 3 million tweets, I ranked the tweets according to the most popular. The vast majority of the content in that was pro-Saudi side of the story. So we know for like the first 10 days of October before Saudi admitted that they had killed him, we knew, obviously in retrospect, that they were lying. So the vast majority of content was actually pro-Saudi. The vast majority in locational data, user-reported locational data on those tweets was Saudi Arabia. So it was really interesting to me that of all the Arabic language content, whilst Jamal Khashoggi trended the least in Saudi Arabia, the majority of information in Arabic about Jamal Khashoggi's death was that reflected Saudi propaganda. Yet this was not reflected in Twitter trends or anything like that. So I think we have a lot in the way of trying to interrogate algorithms and interrogate Twitter trends to see actually what's going on. But we also have to be worried about who has the ability to dominate the kind of social media information sphere going forward. And at the moment, it doesn't appear to be a rosy picture. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Before we move to the final minutes of today's conference, the closing remarks, I would like to thank our panelists this afternoon. Thank you for being here. And for these very interesting and worrisome discussions. Thank you all for sticking around. I would like to close by just trying to summarize a little bit of the highlights from today. In the last few years, cyber geopolitics have taken different shapes and forms in the Arab world, and they have become a rapidly growing trend in Middle East politics. And our speakers today did a great job of giving us an in-depth look into these phenomena and the future prospects of cyber politics. What was perhaps the most unique aspect of today's conversations is the alarming nature of the problem. I've heard the word alarming and urgent a few times today, and the urgency with which the discussion was framed, specifically with regard to freedom of expression and the future of cyber war. One of the speakers said, the most important priority in the Arab world today is the preservation of adequate space for expression. And I think to that end, I would like to highlight three main takeaways, the first of which reflects that, and it's the importance of free press and the freedom of expression for democracy. It cannot be stressed enough how having these tools ensures a healthy public sphere where issues of public concern are subject to discussion, scrutiny, and independent debate, which are necessary preconditions for democratic governance. And yet, we continue to see, as we've heard throughout the day, the suppressions of these freedoms to the point of murder of journalists and dissidents, and with little accountability or mechanisms to address this alarming trajectory. One of the keynote speaker this morning said, any aspirations for justice, human rights, and democracy is directly attached to the media. And the media has the capability to expand democratic possibilities. And so we have to continue to make that a priority. Second, new media tools and platforms present both opportunities and risks. And I think one of the speakers referred to them as a double-edged sword. But it seems more and more so that they have become more part of the problem than the solution, as the structures and the dynamics of power in the Arab world and by authoritarian regimes transfer over to control over media and social media narratives and debates. And we still have outdated and repressive laws like the cyber criminal laws that were mentioned that do not adequately address those challenges. Third, and finally, the issue of cyber politics and cyber warfare is continuously evolving, and it's a growing dangerous trend, especially with the lack of international rights agencies and efforts that ensure the respect for human rights, freedom, and democratic principles in the cybersphere. And it seems like this is just getting started. These tools have low economic and political costs, and they're coupled with a high damaging potential. These cyber capabilities are increasingly being used in geopolitical competitions in the Arab world and elsewhere to violate rights and escalate conflict. Without implementing measures to ensure accountability and ethical policies in cyberspace, the outcomes can be greatly damaging. And I think here is just the main takeaway, which is the primary message from today, has to do with the issue of accountability, or the lack thereof. Accountability to implement existing policies, to enact new needed policies and laws, and to ensure the protection of freedoms and rights. The lack of accountability has been mentioned several times throughout the day as the greatest challenge to progress towards human rights and democracy in the Arab world. And this is one of the important issues that we work on at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. It's part of our mission to provide these perspectives that emphasize on human rights, democracy, and civil liberties, and just and peaceful resolution to conflict. We invite you to continue to follow our work at arabcenterdc.org, and we hope to see you at future events. I would like to thank all the speakers that were with us today. Some of them traveled from 14 hours flights and elsewhere to be with us. Thank you for your great contributions and your insightful discussions and conversations. I would like to thank our boards, the Board of Directors, Academic Advisory Board, and the staff of Arab Center, Washington, D.C. For their support, and the staff for doing a great job in planning for this conference. I would like to thank all of you for being here today, for joining us throughout the day, and especially those of you who stayed all the way till the end. I would also like to thank those joining us online. We've been streaming live on our website. Thank you again, and we hope to see you in the future. Have a good evening.